6 years ago, watching a television show with a live performance, a girl gets excited because the band was really cool. From outside, people shout at her to turn down the volume. Her life as a high school student was very good. She could listen to any music she liked and watch as many cartoons and movies as she wanted, totally at ease. During class, Ju-hyung was reading a magazine when someone caught her attention by suddenly kicking her desk, making her take off her headphones. Two girls were sighing, saying they had called her multiple times, but she hadn't responded even though she was a loser, and they hand her money, telling her to get some pastries. Ju-hyung agrees, though nervous, and heads to the store. She buys 2 pastries, brushing aside some inconveniences at school, as she was generally someone who got along well. On her way back, she ends up tripping and drops both pastries on the floor, shattering them, while she is shocked to realize everything was destroyed faster than she imagined. A person appears, apologizing because it seemed she had tripped over their long, beautiful legs. It looked like they had been sitting there feeling lonely for a minute. The protagonist responds that it's okay, even though this person's legs were indeed very long, and she realizes this must be the famous person who usually sat in the cafeteria. It was then that she heard a song and asked if it was Marilyn Manson. Before Ju-hyung could say this MP3 player was hers, he just turns it off and hands it to her with a smile. This made her blush happily, thanking him because he actually respected her taste in music. The guy from the cafeteria she sometimes ran into knew all about rock and metal bands. The two talk about music together for a while, and Ju-hyung always felt very excited, imagining they got along well together, feeling quite happy. He always greeted her when he saw her. Maybe he liked her, which made her very happy because she clearly liked him too. It was quite a complicated feeling. Still, Ju-hyung could bet he would like this. She had 2 tickets to give him so they could go out, and the next day, she was very happy and ready to do it. That was when she overheard voices talking about how she and the cafeteria guy were dating, laughing because they made the girl blush with those comments. Then, Ju-hyung froze, hearing the same girls who bullied her discussing among themselves that they had taken pictures with the cafeteria guy, and the 2 of them looked really cute together. This girl was Semi Lee, the prettiest girl in school, and everyone praised her because she was indeed a goddess. It must be nice to be as beautiful as Lee, always admired. But Ju-hyung didn't want to believe she was getting involved with the guy she liked, and she trembles in her seat before standing up to leave the classroom. She ran out after throwing away the tickets, crying because they had the same tastes and many things in common. Maybe that was why she had this crazy idea in her mind. Deep down, things could never have worked out with the guy she liked. Lee was always the prettiest girl, and she knew her face was always the big problem in her life. Looking at her reflection while crying, she realizes why no one would ever like an ugly girl like her. Then Ju-hyung goes to her mother, asking her to pay for surgery. She wanted plastic surgery as soon as possible, but neither her mother nor her sister understood anything. It seemed that Ju-hyung had just hit puberty. Her mother replies that a high school student asking for plastic surgery was absurd, if only she were as good as her older sister, at least. Beside her, her other sibling honestly says that she wasn't that attractive and would still be ugly even with plastic surgery, and Ju-hyung complains that everything was too unfair on her side. Asking her mother how she made her sister and Ju-hyung look so pretty while she was ugly, it felt like she was the adopted one in the family, and that made her hate everyone in the house. After locking herself in her room and slamming the door, her mother wonders what happened so suddenly, and her sister replies that she was probably in that sensitive phase because of everything. Her appearance must be what bothered her the most now, but it was true that she was the only ugly one among them, and she wondered why she was born this way, and her mother scolds her for saying that. In her room, the protagonist just keeps crying until she grabs her phone, thinking she shouldn't have gotten mad at her mother over something like this, and starts typing something on social media. She writes on an anonymous forum that she was feeling depressed. This was the place where she could find her only personal hope. There was a guy she liked a lot at school. She thought they could be together and had many things in common, but she was completely wrong. And now she found out he actually liked a pretty person, and now she felt bad. Being an unattractive person was too depressing. 30 minutes after posting, Ju-hyung got curious to see if there were any comments and began to receive several notifications. They were apologizing, saying that a person's appearance was actually very important, suggesting she could learn to use makeup. People seemed quite different that way. The before and after were like opposites. She was quite unattractive, but with makeup, she felt much more confident and even provided a link for the protagonist to see the cosmetics. Surprised, Ju-kyung wondered if this could be her big salvation, wanting to know what good could come from clicking the link, and she pressed it out of curiosity to find out. She opened a site that narrated the miracle of using makeup, showing the difference between before and after, shocking Ju-kyung because it seemed like exactly what she needed at that moment. A bit later, she left the house, promising she would return afterward, ignoring her mother's questions about why she was leaving so late, and simply went to the store. When she entered, Ju-kyung started with BB cream, lip tint, and eyeliner. She bought a bit of makeup, first applied the BB cream, then the eyeliner, and finally the lip tint with beautiful colors. Though she was finished, she took a photo with her phone and was somewhat shocked because it still felt like something was missing. Nonetheless, it looked at least a little better than before. Suddenly, Young entered the room to deliver something their mother brought, and Ju-kyung turned, asking if he had at least heard of knocking before barging into her room. He dropped the clothes on the floor in shock, making the protagonist happy because it must mean she looked pretty, but he closed his eyes as if they burned from the sight. It was enough to blind a man, and he ran away while Ju-kyung told him to leave, wondering what was wrong with her brother and if her makeup looked that strange. The more she looked at herself, the better it seemed. The next day, when she went to school wearing makeup, everyone stared at her in confusion. It was too strange to get so much attention. That must be how pretty girls felt, and nervous, she entered the classroom trying to stay calm, wondering if she looked at least a little different that day. Suddenly, one of the girls laughed out loud, pointing at Ju-kyung, saying it seemed like she'd changed her makeup style and used a marker to draw all over her eye, leaving it completely black. Still laughing loudly, they waited curiously to see how the principal would react to her face. Unattractive girls couldn't stand out no matter what they did to their faces. As the girls laughed, Ju-kyung realized she was right from the start. An unattractive person was still the same even with makeup, and she went home, taking more photos. She posted a photo on an open discussion forum with a temporary post, wanting to know if her makeup really looked strange. She needed proper feedback. To her surprise, she received several responses, and one of them asked if she really went out with a black marker on her eyes, and Ju-kyung realized she did look terrible. One commenter suggested she should start by fixing her eyebrows. They looked like caterpillars, so she began using an app to clean them up and fix them as quickly as possible. Ju-kyung realized the comment was correct. It was indeed better to address that issue, and she received another comment suggesting she read the third top post to help her. When she looked, a girl decided to give some makeup tips and secrets for using double eyelid glue, and as she started reading, the tutorial explained how it worked. She showed how her eyes looked with the double eyelid glue and contact lenses. Some people asked for information about the lenses, which were brown from a specific brand. Ju-kyung was shocked that something like this was possible, but that was how she decided to embark on that big new journey. The day to deal with her eyebrows had arrived, and she grabbed a blade, leaving the house again to address the situation, going to the stores and returning an hour later, throwing everything she bought onto her bed, not knowing where to start. The result of her expedition was tremendous, and Ju-kyung spent all her money. She decided to start by working on her eyebrows and picked up the blade to clean up the hairs. In the end, she removed too much of her eyebrows to the point where she almost lost them entirely, but it was okay because she could still fix it later, as long as she stayed calm. She removed her eyebrows, and now it was time for the double eyelid, but she managed to mess up the application as well. Her attempts all failed, but improved over time. The eyelid glue was difficult to use, and she applied the eyelash curler before putting on the lenses, finally finishing with mascara, surprised and unable to believe the impressive results she achieved. It didn't even look like her in the mirror, so she redraws her eyebrow and takes a photo, posting it and asking how her makeup looked again this time. The comments praised her for looking beautiful. It didn't even look like the same person, and she seemed to have some kind of natural beauty to look as good so quickly with a little practice. Ju-kyung was almost moved because they called her pretty, and she happily threw herself on the bed. From that day on, she started reading beauty blogs and makeup magazines. She spent her winter break practicing to improve her makeup whenever she could, and months passed until the start of the school year, and Ju-kyung returned to school. When she entered the classroom, she looked like a different person, and that's how her new school life began. Everyone was shocked, staring at her, but she tries to stay calm on her way in. Fortunately, she ended up at a school far enough away that no one would recognize her as they did at the previous one. Thinking about it, this school was far away, and she had no friends there. Everyone seemed close. It would be complicated to get close to other students, but Jugi-young was used to being alone, just hoping no one would pick on her. But for some reason, everyone was staring at the protagonist, looking surprised, whispering about how beautiful she was, and showing interest in Jugi-young. She felt quite proud of herself. All her training over the break seemed worth it when suddenly someone tapped her back, and she looked back at the desk. She saw two girls asking her name. One was Cherin-on, and the other Suo-kang. Ju-hyung introduces herself to them too, a bit embarrassed by the attention. As she heard more compliments from the girls there, wanting her phone number, getting closer to other students was easy, and people quickly started talking about her name. She posted photos in a cafe and got a lot of attention. People commented that she was the new student from class 2 who was incredibly pretty, and they even wanted her phone number. Gradually, the boys started showing more interest in her, even when Ju-hyung completely ignored them, but she was so beautiful she seemed like the goddess of the school. She became quite well known, and at home, even her brother would ask who she was because she looked like a totally different person without makeup, which was really strange. Ju-hyung complains that it wasn't a problem. It was better to act like they didn't know each other when they met in public, but Young took a picture of her, saying he would show the truth to everyone. Desperate, Ju-hyung grabs him, demanding he give it back before she kills him, and the two argue inside the house until she decides to give up and let him do what he wants, saying she would go buy some chicken as long as he deleted the photo, and he deletes it, much to Ju-hyung's annoyance. Her brother was really an annoying brat, but she sighs to calm herself. For now, she decided to finish the chapter. That was indeed the best manga. Although at school there were tensions, at home, she could enjoy her hobbies without worries. She just read comics, even when her friends asked and talked about romantic gossip and things like that. At school, she was labeled as the beautiful girl everyone knew. So keeping her image of eating little and doing things was quite exhausting, but thanks to makeup, it seemed like a smooth journey until the third year of high school. One day, she decides to go out to buy some things at her comic shop, trying not to get too annoyed because Young always wanted to take advantage of her, asking her to buy things too. In the store, she was quite happy, feeling the smell of the shop. It was like paradise. Ju-hyung approached to see what the new releases were and finally found the manga in question. It was a classic horror comic, but before she could grab the book, which only had one copy, her hand touches someone else's, and she jumps to the side. Ju-hyung is a bit impressed because it was a handsome guy who looked like a celebrity. She never knew someone like him lived in the neighborhood where she was living now. After just staring at her, he lowers his gaze to the book in her arms, saying he saw it first and it was his, simply taking the horror book from the shelf before her. She just watches as he goes to the counter to get the manga, leaving Ju-hyung behind without saying anything else, which leaves her completely outraged. It didn't matter if he saw it first, it was too arrogant of him. He completely ignored whether she wanted that manga as much as he did. The more she thought about it, the more it was ridiculous. It was such an idiotic logic. A little later, Ju-hyung returned home and immediately heard her brother asking where the ice cream he asked for was on her way out of the house. Then she handed him the bag, commenting that she had heard he was dating someone, and it was probably a girl similar to Ju-hyung when she was at home. But Young denied it, saying it was completely impossible. Even his girlfriend's breathing was beautiful, to which Ju-hyung joked that he should face the harsh reality already, or he would end up disappointed later on. The next day, the protagonist asked her mother where her bag had gone, and she replied that it wasn't her only bag. Moreover, the other one hadn't dried, so she should take a different one. Ju-hyung complained because it was her only good bag, and her mother replied that it was absurd for her to have only one good bag. The old one was enough, and she could use it that day. When the protagonist picked up the old bag, she grimaced because it was the same one she used during middle school. Nobody else used that kind of thing these days. She really didn't want to go through the trouble of using it now. Even so, Ju-hyung took it, hoping no one would notice. At school, she went out with her friends, chatting about the K-pop concert from the previous weekend, when she saw a guy walking down the hall and recognized that face quickly. It was the guy she saw the day before in the store who wanted the manga first. Ju-kyung turned her face to hide from him, but he walked past her without even noticing her presence. She wondered what he was doing at that school until Kang and On commented that he was the new transfer student, the handsome guy making everyone go crazy. His name must have been Suo Lee or something similar. They'd heard he was a real jerk, even a sociopath, and Ji-kyung thought it might be true. She hadn't expected to see him again, especially still within her school, and she worried about the possibility of Lee recognizing her. Her friends continued gossiping, noting that he still looked quite good. He was also quite smart. They heard he was at the top of the class at his old school. Ju-kyung felt a bit sorry for Lee, despite him being a new student. People were focused on him, but it was doubtful that he was actually a sociopath. Along the way, a man named Han asked if they were heading back. They happily responded, complimenting him on how handsome he looked as always, which made him laugh, saying they were being silly and asking them not to doze off during class. Ju-kyung sighed because Han was always charming. The three girls lamented, saying they'd be devastated when he got married, and time passed until school ended. The protagonist felt depressed, frustrated that of all possible places, he ended up at her school. Even the convenience store girl and her neighbor thought the same about how there were two different versions of Ju-kyung, so she hoped he wouldn't recognize her, sighing. She wished that really wouldn't happen. He couldn't know anything, and just then, Kang approached, asking if she was okay. She looked a bit sad and suggested they could go out to buy a gloss she was using. It was on sale, and the protagonist agreed, having completely forgotten about it. Ju-kyung asked her if she'd try the water tint, which was amazing. Her friend agreed and said she might buy one as well, while Ju-kyung said their blush was out of this world too. But little did she realize that while walking, suddenly, her keychain snapped in half, and just the body of it fell from her bag onto the floor. Then someone passed by and picked it up, and that day, Ju-kyung later discovered she shouldn't have used that bag at school that day. Meanwhile, after shopping, the two went out to eat, chatting about the lip tint, which was really cheap. Ju-kyung agreed, saying she'd buy all of them if she had the money, and suggested that Kang try a different shade she just bought. When she tried it, the protagonist was thrilled because she looked absolutely beautiful, and then Kang asked her to take a photo of her. Ju-kyung did so until she suddenly heard a song playing and recognized it as Linkin Park. It seemed the store owner had good taste in music when Kang asked what was wrong with that song, saying the owner must have terrible taste. This caught the protagonist off guard, who nervously agreed, even though she internally disagreed. Then Kang asked if she was taking Japanese as a second language. Ju-kyung agreed, saying she could also use the credits for social studies, so Kang continued, mentioning Tahoon because there was a guy in his class in high school who was really good at Japanese, and they wanted to start a study group, asking if the protagonist would like to study with them since they met every weekend. The protagonist feels nervous and replies that she could barely understand hiragana yet, so maybe it wasn't a good idea, but Kang keeps begging her to do it, as it would help her with her grades too, whispering that the guy in Tahoon's class was good at Japanese and also very handsome, suddenly making the protagonist tempted to go to the classes anyway. She ends up agreeing to the Japanese classes, making her friend happy, as they could meet downtown at Bugstar the next day at 2 p.m. for it. The two say goodbye, and Ju-kyung returns home, lying down to rest and feeling happy, thinking about a handsome guy she might meet the next day, feeling quite excited. Finally, the day had come when she could talk to a guy, making her very anxious and happy, wondering how handsome he might be, imagining all kinds of possibilities. A study group opened up various possibilities. They could sit close to each other and start getting closer, maybe even go on dates, and she could finally say goodbye to single life. The idea became even more fanciful, going out with a friendly, handsome guy who would help with her studies. That's when her sister entered, startling the protagonist and asking what she was doing. She asks if she could borrow a face mask, and Ju-kyung lends it to her, telling her to buy one herself once in a while, and time passes until the next day. The protagonist woke up close to noon, as the big moment had finally arrived. She was trying to go with her most natural look possible, using brown contact lenses. She applied eyelid glue, sunscreen, and a light dab of CC cushion, a bit of brown eyeshadow for some depth, then used the eyelash curler and brown eyeliner for a sweeter, more innocent look, a touch of peach blush, and finally coral lip tint. She was perfect and ready to go, taking the opportunity to snap a selfie. Then she was shocked to realize it was almost 2 p.m. and had to hurry, messaging Kang that she was running late and asking if everyone was already there. Kang replies that everyone was there, but it was okay as long as she hurried. So a little later, Ju Hyung finally arrives at the study group where Kang waves at her. The protagonist approaches with a sigh of relief because she was very nervous. She sees the back of the guy who was supposed to be the handsome one and already feels her heart beating faster. She greets them with a shy smile but then freezes when she realizes that the guy there is Lee, not understanding how she could keep running into the bookstore guy so often in such a short time. She stammers an apology for being late, and Kang says it's fine without noticing her nervousness, wondering if Lee could recognize her with makeup on. He just stares at her, which makes Ju Hyung tense because she was receiving too much attention, and she tries to calm herself because it couldn't be possible, no matter how she looked away. It was too obvious that Lee was staring at her intensely, making her think she was in big trouble now. Time passed in the study group, and Ju Hyung was still nervous. Finally, Kang announces they're done for the day, and the protagonist manages to return home safely, though worried that he might have recognized her and stayed silent. But given the way he looked at her, it was concerning because he might have figured it out, and she hoped that wasn't the case. It was so tense that it felt like her head was going to explode. She needed some fresh air and decided to return the comic she had borrowed, so Ju Hyung goes back to the bookstore to pick up a new manga this time. Although she tries to reach it, it was too high for her to get. That's when someone approached and asked her to move, and she freezes in shock when she realizes it's actually Lee beside her. However, instead of Ju Hyung having enough time to be surprised that they met in the same place again, he just gestures for her to step aside. He had a comic he wanted to grab, and she was in front of it, so Ju Hyung quickly moves to the side to give him space, and from his reaction, it seemed he truly didn't recognize her. She celebrates internally that this was indeed possible and feels quite proud of herself after worrying for nothing. Finally, she notices he picked up a stack to read. Ju Hyung comments that the one he chose was really bad, making him look at her, and she nervously explains that it was a comic that started well but got worse halfway through. If she were him, she would pick something else to read, even though she's tense because he moved closer and seemed ready to say something. Lee asks what she would recommend to read. Half panicked because he looked quite serious, Ju Hyung searched for one of the titles she liked. It was the debut work of a certain writer, a really good piece of art. Offering it to him, she recommended it if he liked thrillers, saying the series had 20 volumes and was worth reading. Then he opened it to take a look at the comic himself. He mentioned it better not be rubbish, then took the comic the protagonist recommended, leaving her a bit shocked because he didn't even thank her. She could hardly believe how rude Lee could be, and time passed until the next day, where she saw him again and felt happy because he wouldn't recognize her with makeup. However, despite Ju Hyung trying to greet him, he just walked past her as if she were invisible, and she tried to approach him again to talk, but he was cold once more. He questioned what she wanted from him, and Ju Hyung got nervous because it seemed he didn't recognize her, mentioning that they'd studied together in Japanese class a few days before. He turned away, looking like he didn't remember, which surprised her again. Then she mentioned she didn't get his number last time, asking if he could give it to her now. However, Lee just stared at her intensely before finally taking his phone and adding her number, telling her never to contact him unless it was truly urgent. Ju Hyung realized that his personality was even worse than people had said. Time passed, and she went to the bookstore again, looking for something really gory this time. She should have gone with her sister so she'd at least be allowed into the adult section. That was when Lee appeared to talk to her, leaving her confused by the encounter. After all, they always saw each other there, almost as if he worked at the store, and he shyly said he'd read the comic Ju Hyung recommended, and that it was actually pretty good. He even read the whole story in just one day, and she agreed it was indeed genius, because she knew he would enjoy that comic. She offered to recommend others if he wanted because she knew a lot about the world of comics, so she began showing Lee several more, and they finally left the store, with her still talking about checking out the blog she recommended. Finally, Ju Hyung turned to leave, but Lee asked her to wait and nervously thanked her for recommending the comics to him, which left her in shock. He seemed completely different from the person he was at school. It didn't even seem possible, almost as if the guy at school and the shy one in the bookstore were two different people. That's what the internet was for, so she posted on a forum about a guy she was interested in, describing someone she'd been talking to a lot recently. They frequented the same bookstore, but he didn't recognize her without makeup, thinking they were two different people, and he was a complete jerk at school, but different at the bookstore. He was almost sweet there, and she asked what could be the reason for that, mentioning that in the bookstore, she didn't even bother using makeup to look a little better. Replies poured in, saying maybe this guy felt super uncomfortable around pretty girls and more at ease with those who seemed more ordinary and natural. Ju-kyung wondered if that could really be it. Others suggested that something more might be going on. Maybe he liked her better without makeup than with it, which should be practically impossible, and Ju-kyung blushed because it didn't seem possible at all, and everyone kept laughing at her posts because she was entertaining. Embarrassed, she lay on her bed, feeling like she was going crazy with this whole story. Then she barged into her brother's room without bothering to knock. She asked what he thought of a girl like her, and Young replied that it should be obvious, which she denied because she wanted his honest opinion about her now. So, he started talking about Ju-kyung's ridiculous face or her terrible fashion sense, but she ignored his words, looking at herself in the mirror and smiling, considering that maybe there was at least one guy who might find her attractive like this, but he denied it, saying it couldn't happen even in a million years, telling her to get out of his room. She went to wash her face, thinking that as annoying as her brother was, he was right. Thinking it over, no one would like someone with a plain, unattractive face like hers. It reminded her of the things she had been through because of her appearance, and she recalled when she took a bus listening to music and two guys passed by chatting down the aisle. Ju-kyung was frustrated because her music player's battery died, and she overheard the boys talking about her, calling her ugly, laughing because she could hear them even though it was just the truth. Or when she went out shopping with her sister, and the guys would invite her sister to hang out with them, completely abandoning and ignoring Ju-kyung as if she were invisible. She had seen all kinds of things and situations. She was used to it. Facing reality was necessary. Lee wouldn't normally look at a girl as unattractive as her. However, when Ju-kyung went to the bookstore again, she was surprised because the owner handed her a gift bag that Lee had left for her, mentioning a message. It was about how she came by every day, and she was somewhat shocked because he saw her as the girl with glasses and a hoodie. Still, Ju-kyung opens the bag and finds a book inside. It was a limited edition copy signed by the author himself, and he left a message saying he appreciated her reading and wanted to give her a gift as a thank you. Ju-kyung feels touched and wonders how he managed to buy something so rare. She could hardly believe that, deep down, Lee was truly a kind-hearted person. The next day, the protagonist sees him and notices that, in the bookstore, he was indeed pleasant, but when she wore makeup, he was a very cold and distant guy, almost rude. It was very easy to talk to him at the bookstore, but now it was impossible to converse, and she wondered why. A bit later, they finished their Japanese study sessions as usual. Afterward, Kang mentioned to the protagonist how strange it was that Lee only talked about school stuff in study sessions, never discussing anything interesting or off-topic. She had never seen him smile even once, and Ju-kyung agrees, though she remembers him smiling many times with his comics. Kang said there were rumors about him. He had been much friendlier in middle school, but something must have happened that completely changed his personality. Either way, she couldn't wait for the chance when they could become friends with him, but Ju-kyung could only think about what kind of past Lee might have had before high school to become so cold. At home, while cleaning her face, she suddenly received a notification and realized it was her alarm, reminding her it was the day of the annual sale and she needed to hurry to the bookstore. She decides to go out just as she had finished removing her makeup, ready to buy everything she needed, and she would definitely need that big bag to carry everything. The protagonist rushes out after letting her mom know, surprised to arrive at the store, which was packed with people. They weren't joking about the half-price sale. Even though it was crowded, she would never give up, so she kept pushing through, trying to grab what she wanted, squeezing between the other people in the store to make her purchases. A bit later, Ju-kyung comes out exhausted, but at least got everything she needed and completed her mission, and now she could go home until someone calls her name. Ju-kyung turns to see that it's Lee, who comments that he knew it was her, which leaves her shocked and wondering why he would appear just now. She stammers that he must have mistaken her for someone else, as her name wasn't Ju-kyung, and she didn't even know what she was saying, feeling nervous at that point. Lee insists he knows it's her, which only makes her panic even more, trying to think of a way to resolve the situation. The first option was to run, The second was to pretend she forgot him, and the third was just to tell the truth, but all of them seemed bad. Ju Young just wanted to leave as quickly as possible and hide. When he approaches, Ju Young shrinks back, saying she's not interested and to keep away from her, which leaves Lee a bit shocked by what she's suddenly saying. And people around them start murmuring about the scene, and the protagonist takes advantage of the distraction to quickly flee, leaving him behind, and Lee is left confused by her escape. People around him keep looking at him, even as he tries to explain that nothing happened, and Ju Young just keeps running, begging him to forget this ever happened. That night, at home, she arrives exhausted, unable to believe that just when she'd found her place at school, someone discovered the truth, and she worries about what might happen if everyone finds out. They would certainly laugh at her and bully her, just like in her previous school. Once they found out, everything would end up on social media. And when everyone knew, her friends would abandon her, her life would become depressing, she wouldn't get into college, she wouldn't find a boyfriend, and then she'd be excluded from everything. That left her desperate. None of this could happen. They could never find out the truth, so Ju Young thought that if she denied everything, Lee would forget, and nothing would happen. She tried to stay positive because everything might be okay, so she went to school the next day with dark circles from insomnia, thinking there wouldn't be anyone in the classroom so early. However, the first person she encountered was Lee himself, leaving her shocked because it was 6:30 in the morning, and even in the classroom, she couldn't have peace so early. She turned to leave, but Lee approached her to talk, which made Ju Young freeze, but she smiled back in greeting, trying to pretend nothing happened. He asked if it was a joke to her, and Ju Young didn't understand, which irritated him because he'd seen her the day before, and she played dumb as if he were crazy and seeing things. Before she could escape again, he grabbed her backpack strap, making her shrink back and cover her face, internally begging for help, until he pointed to her keychain's doll. Ju Young realized he found the piece that had fallen from her keychain, understanding it must have dropped at some point, and he must have picked it up. Ju Young was shocked and wondered where she had dropped it. The body of the keychain doll was missing, and now she had no excuse to explain herself this time. So, she dropped to her knees, begging him not to tell anyone, as her friends had never seen her without makeup. She'd do anything he asked as long as he told no one. He stayed silent, and Ju Young grew tense, thinking that maybe, deep down, he could be a better person than he seemed, like he was in the bookstore, hoping he'd show his angelic, sweet side now. Maybe he'd promised that her secret would be safe with him, but Lee asked if she would do anything he said, and she agreed, though she was very surprised. This wasn't the reaction she expected. Then he announced that from now on, she would do everything he told her, and Ju Young remembered, after forgetting, that he was a jerk. Then, Lee told her she should feel honored to serve as his underling, and he nodded, as if he alone could decide, but she could leave it open if she wanted to. Ju Young asked him to wait and not leave like that, because she could do what he said if he insisted so much, as long as her secret wouldn't spread to anyone. Then, her words made him smile, satisfied with her response. After that, she could only run away, regretting that she had to meet this guy. That made her furious, because it was all due to not using a different bag from the start. As long as she fulfilled all of Lee's demands from now on, then everything could stay as it was before. Even in shock, she tried to convince herself that it would be okay and kept a positive outlook to reassure herself. The next day, Ju Young tried to stay confident. What she needed at a time like this was a face that showed more confidence than ever. Skin was the key to good makeup. That day, she needed a good amount of foundation. She applied the foundation and then covered her facial imperfections. Finally, she completed her makeup work and ended up crossing paths with Lee again, nervously smiling at him, though he questioned why she seemed surprised. Ju Young asked how he was and mentally wondered if it had all started already. Then he smiled, saying he was great, and mentioned he was a bit thirsty and wanted her to bring him juice, specifically apple juice. For a moment, Ju Young was a bit confused as he stared her down, until she finally ran off and returned with the boxed juice. Then he tossed several papers into her hands, saying he needed to take care of something and she should bring these to his room for now, even though Ju Young muttered in irritation. She'd need patience to deal with this sort of thing. She tried to stay calm and patient because she really wanted to punch him, but instead, she just agreed with Lee's words. After placing the papers on his desk, she realized this would be her life from now on. He was truly going to take advantage of her, which made her want to give him a good kick in the back. Then she overheard voices talking about how Lee seemed like the most handsome guy in school, not to mention he had the highest grades in the class. If it weren't for his personality, he'd be the perfect guy. The girls gossip, wondering if he had a girlfriend. He probably didn't, but they could try their luck to go out with him, which left Jugyeong a bit shocked to overhear. They would never say such things if they knew him the way she did. As she walked away, suddenly Lee himself appeared, asking what she was doing there. She stammers that it's nothing, waving as she tries to leave and hoping not to be called back, and he just sighs because she was truly a weirdo at heart. Even though Jugyeong thought it didn't matter how handsome Lee was on the outside if, on the inside, he was a complete jerk, always asking her to do things on the first day of their deal. On top of that, he was treating her like a total demon. Time passed in class, and it was lunchtime. As they walked, they crossed paths again in the hallway, and the protagonist shrinks and turns her face away, mentally hoping he would go easy on her with his requests. He just moves his mouth silently, gesturing for her to follow him somewhere. Lee passes by the protagonist and her friends, who mention that they'll go back to the teacher to take care of something before saying goodbye to her so she can join them for lunch later. Finally, for some unknown reason, the two end up going up to the rooftop, even though Jugyeong reminds him that only authorized people were allowed up there. If they were caught, they could get into trouble. However, Lee just tells her to be quiet and not make a sound. He finally opens the door, and Jugyeong sighs at the beautiful view. She had never been to the rooftop before, and it was more impressive than she had imagined. Finally, he hands his bag to the protagonist for her to hold. She asks what exactly it was. It seemed like it was a lunchbox and food, but she didn't understand why he was giving it to her, and he sits down, replying that it wasn't for her. Actually, Lee had brought his sister's lunch by mistake, so he thought he'd give it to her instead. It seemed like, on top of everything, he even planned to choose what Jugyeong would eat. But either way, when she sat down to eat, it was a delicious meal, and she comments that his mom cooks really well, and he just stays silent, watching her eat. This makes Jugyeong nervous because once again, Lee was staring at her so intensely that it made her a bit tense, and he murmurs that he can't even believe it's really her. Jugyeong asks what he said because she didn't quite hear him. Besides, it was too hot on the rooftop, and they should go back inside where it was cooler. Then he mentions that she'd said before that she liked that other story, and Jugyeong feels happy about the change of topic, as he must have seen the things she wrote on her blog. She was excited to see it in the theater when it would be showing, and that's how, suddenly, she ended up going with Lee again the following weekend. It was to go to the movies with the jerk Lee, using her as an excuse to watch the movie he'd wanted to see from the start. Though annoyed, she asks if he couldn't do things differently. After all, this was the kind of movie to watch with friends, until he tells her he doesn't have any friends, suddenly creating a sudden chill and awkward silence between them. Feeling completely uncomfortable, Jugyeong laughs nervously because nobody really went with classmates to see those things, and then he asks why she's wearing makeup now. She replies that if she went out without makeup, everyone would be talking behind her back, saying he was too handsome to be walking around with her. It was all about money and things like that, so Jugyeong changes the subject, suggesting they go play some games, even as Lee tries to tell her that wasn't true. They head to the arcade. However, he is completely shocked, and she teases him about it being his first time at an arcade, and he asks her not to tease him. Laughing, the protagonist suggests they should take advantage of the moment and find something he likes, but they end up in a zombie shooting game that he was really good at. Jugyeong jokes that she was just letting him win to enjoy a bit, but this was a classic game. The two sit down to play an arcade fighting game on the machine. However, even though he'd never been to an arcade, Lee defeats her easily, and Jugyeong wonders how he isn't a professional, saying they've been playing for over 10 minutes. Instead of stopping, it seemed like Lee was really having fun, and Jugyeong holds back a laugh because he looked like a kid acting like that, and he stands up, embarrassed, to leave. Grumbling that he was annoyed now, she suggested they should take a selfie together, something Lee quickly refused, but she teased him again about his reaction. He probably didn't even know how that machine worked, explaining that it was a pure Kura machine. While the two were debating whether to take a picture, a girl saw them. She recognized Lee in that conversation. When she got home again, the protagonist was caught off guard by a pimple appearing right on her chin, the worst spot possible. There was also one on her forehead. These pimples were huge, making her sigh because they were too big to squeeze. She didn't know how she'd go to school afterward. It seemed she'd have to go to school and continue being Lee's errand girl, wondering how long she'd have to endure this situation. She laid her head on the table, lamenting her fate. As she wondered what she should do, she suddenly realized she still had the photos she took with Lee, remembering how he'd smiled that day. He didn't seem like a complete jerk then, and Ju-Young didn't know what to think about it. This depression was making her crave something sweet to try and feel a bit better. Suddenly, she saw Young appearing, complaining because he had a cold, and asked her to bring him some medicine and tea, asking her to take care of him a little. So Ju-Young went out to buy the things and also some chocolates, but she suddenly heard what seemed to be a kitten meowing nearby. She ended up finding a little kitten meowing and could hardly believe how cute it was. But before she could approach it, she saw a shadowy figure nearby. She let out a surprised scream, and the person also shouted in shock. Then Ju-Young realized it was Lee standing there, and she asked what he was doing there at that time of day. He looked shy and averted his gaze to the can of fish he'd brought for the cat, awkwardly saying he was just out for a walk and decided to take a break there. Ju-Young could tell it was a big lie, realizing he must have been trying to feed the kitten. She crouched down, saying it was a shame since kittens like that suffered. On the streets, they usually didn't survive for long on their own. She petted the cat while Lee agreed with her, still embarrassed as the protagonist teased him. After a moment, she offered him a chocolate drink, and they sat on a bench, with the protagonist mentioning the movie they'd seen the other day. She said it wasn't bad, but he stayed silent, just drinking, until Ju-Young changed the topic and apologized for the things she'd said in the street the other day when she panicked. He replied that it was fine, so she said she knew it was a lot to ask, but she hoped he wouldn't tell anyone about her real face, which made him sigh. Not understanding why he'd tell anyone, he thought it was probably the same for all girls. Ju-Young replied that it wasn't like that at all, it was totally different for her. Many girls would kill him if they heard him saying things like that. It wasn't that common for makeup to change a person's face so much that they looked like a different person. It should almost be illegal to look so different. Suddenly, Ju-Young received a call from her younger brother, asking if she was coming back with the tea leaves soon. He asked her to hurry because he was almost dying of pain, so she agreed that she'd head back. Lee asked who it was on the call, wondering if it was her brother calling her. The protagonist confirmed, explaining that he had a cold. Lee asked if he looked like her, and Ju-Young replied that he definitely didn't. He'd be furious with such a comparison. Anyway, she had to get home quickly. However, to her surprise, Lee threw a jacket into her arms, telling her to take it, explaining it was cold and he didn't want her to get sick. He then said goodbye and left, and she thanked him, still a bit surprised. Later, Ju-Young returned home, feeling strange about Lee's gesture. Young kept pleading for help because he was sick and asked where she got that jacket. It was clearly someone else's because it was super expensive and quite famous. He begged the protagonist to let him try it on just once, and when she agreed, she couldn't understand how Lee could have such an expensive jacket. It cost $1,000,000, and she couldn't understand why a teenager would wear something so pricey. Finally, Ju-Young took the jacket back from her brother after he snapped a quick selfie. The next day, her friends asked how Ju-Young managed to become friends with Lee, leaving her confused, but they mentioned that they saw he sent her a message. They also all wanted his number. While they were walking through the cafeteria, suddenly a girl falls on the floor and spills her food, drawing everyone's attention. Ju-Young approaches to ask if she's okay and realizes that she's a stunningly beautiful girl. The girl asks if Ju-Young could clean it up for her now. The protagonist agrees, even though Kang questions why, since it was the girl who tripped over Ju-Young and not the other way around. But she responds that it's okay because it dirtied her uniform. Kang whispers that the girl, Sujin Kang, always did things to draw people's attention and had clearly created that dramatic scene on purpose. Ju-Young responds that she didn't think something like that was possible and thanks Kang for helping her clean up. A bit later, Sujin went off to find out more about the protagonist. Hearing rumors that she seduced Lee, even though she wasn't that pretty, she decides to add her on social media. At home, the protagonist ends up hearing from her mom that something arrived. She quickly and happily goes to see that her double eyelid tape order finally arrived. Now she could say goodbye to disasters with eyelid glue on her face. With these ultra-thin tapes, The world could be hers. She just needed to cleanse her skin well, place the tapes on her eyelids, and she'd have a natural double eyelid. To finish, she only had to add a little eyeliner, achieving the perfect look. She decides to take a selfie, only to realize she received a notification. It was a friend request from Soojin Kang, and she's surprised by Soojin's profile picture. She's a stunning girl, and Ju Hyung wonders how she could be so beautiful, though she seems familiar. She could easily recognize her, maybe from TV. Time passes until the next day, and Ju Hyung asks who the girl was who added her on social media the day before. She shows her phone to her friend Kang, who exclaims in shock because it's the girl who bumped into her in the cafeteria, making the protagonist remember. Kang says she was indeed desperate for attention. Her photos showed a lot of her body, and she judged Soojin for seeming a bit crazy for posting things like that. Even in high school, where they shouldn't present themselves in that way, it was clear she had a fit body, but the clothes she was wearing in the photos went beyond. It was obvious she was trying to show off, leaving little to the imagination. Around them, some boys comment that Kang must be jealous of Soojin to say that, but she questions why they're listening to other people's conversations like that, and the boys insist that it was obvious that any girl would show off her body if she had one like Soojin's. Kang refuses, saying she'd never do that. Anyway, she didn't have anyone to show it to, and they reply that it doesn't matter. It just seemed like Kang didn't have the courage to do it. Ju Hyung tries to keep her friend calm even as she gets irritated, asking her to ignore them, and Kang sighs, saying that's why she doesn't make friends with other boys. While looking at her phone and Soojin's social media, the protagonist thinks that maybe she really was showing her body a bit too much. But to her, Soojin was still very beautiful. And she wonders if people hated her just for that, though she fully agreed that Soojin had a practically perfect face and body for any girl. When she compared her own body to hers, she felt a little envy. Later on, Ju Hyung went out to meet Lee, who asks why she wanted to see him that day. She hands back the jacket he lent her the other day, apologizing because her brother wore it once as well, and asks if he'd like her to just give the jacket to him as a gift then. But she's shocked by the proposal, not understanding why he'd offer something so expensive to that brat, and Ju Hyung firmly declines because her brother would go crazy. The protagonist says they could go to the comic store and then stop by the convenience store, while Soojin was just watching from a distance, visibly furious at the scene. That evening, the two walked together in a long 10-minute silence. Ju Hyung couldn't take it anymore. She wanted to break that silence as quickly as possible. So she comments on how delicious that snack his mom made was, and he replies that he doesn't have a mother, causing the protagonist to choke and spit out her drink. Apologizing for being so insensitive, after seeing that she had spilled the drink on herself, Lee offered a tissue for her to clean up, commenting that they were almost there now. He said goodbye to Ju Hyung, assuring her there was no need to worry about what she'd said, and she just nervously waved goodbye as they parted ways. As they separated, the protagonist almost died of embarrassment because she had said such awful things to him before. It seems she always managed to mess things up when she was around Lee. At home, the protagonist removed her makeup and felt heavy in her stomach, probably from eating too much at the convenience store. Looking at herself in the mirror, seeing her reflection, she felt a bit annoyed because she couldn't stand having that little belly fat. It would be much nicer to have Soojin's body. Suddenly, her sister noticed and approached. Laughing, she asked what Ju Hyung was doing, and Ju Hyung blushed in embarrassment, questioning how long she had been there. Her sister replied that it didn't matter. She couldn't sleep. With her mom snoring so loudly, she wasn't sure if it was because her parents slept in separate rooms, but both of them snored, their dad in the living room and mom in the bedroom. Her sister suggested that Ju Hyung could share a room with her again. It wouldn't interfere since she didn't even study or do homework anyway. However, remembering the bad experiences of sleeping next to her sister, Ju Hyung stammered that she was still busy as a student, not having the courage to refuse, but not wanting it either. Her sister grumbled that she didn't care. Then Ju Hyung received a reply notification from Soojin, and the two exchanged messages for a while on social media right there. When the protagonist woke up the next day, she didn't feel like doing anything. Even though she was doing nothing, she intensely wanted to keep doing nothing, feeling exhausted and lazy. It was the weekend when she received a notification from her older sister asking if Ju Hyung would like to have lunch with her, as there was a cool Japanese restaurant nearby. Sighing, even though she didn't feel like going out, Japanese food was tempting, so she just decided to agree. A bit later, the two met up, and her sister was surprised. Because Ju-kyung hadn't dressed up, her face was all oily, and she asked if she had even washed it before leaving the house. The protagonist replied no, as it didn't make any difference. The two got in line, shocked by the number of people waiting, and her sister explained that at famous restaurants, they always had to wait to get in and eat properly. It was extremely hot, but finally, the two reached the restaurant entrance, where Ju-kyung was happy because they could finally eat, though it looked smaller from the outside than she expected. They ordered katsudon and soba. Suddenly, some women appeared to take photos of the dishes, and the protagonist asked her sister why they were doing that. She replied that they were bloggers. When the food arrived, the protagonist was thrilled because it smelled wonderful, and she began eating, impressed by how tasty it was, hardly believing it was that delicious. While eating, Ju-hyung noticed two women at another table whispering and putting a strand of hair in their dish, which shocked her because the two called for the chef. When the chef arrived, the women complained that there was hair in their food, questioning why they didn't seem to care about the hygiene of that place. Despite this, the chef apologized, offering to prepare another dish, but one woman grumbled, saying she was furious and didn't want an apology, only wanted her money back, even threatening him. Otherwise, he'd go bankrupt if they posted about this scandal on their blog. That's when the protagonist's sister slammed the table, asking if they thought they were all that. They didn't even look like bloggers, just beggars, shocking Ju-kyung because her sister got involved in the unfair fight. She tried to hold back her older sister, who was furious. The protagonist asked her to calm down, saying they had seen everything. They'd clearly put their own hair in the food, and it wasn't even the chef's hair color. When the two women were confronted, they became nervous and decided to leave, incredulous that these two had interfered, and even called the chef ugly to his face. A bit later, the chef thanked the two of them for defending him, and Ju-kyung replied that it was fine because those two girls had started it. The chef said he wished he could repay them for their help, but they replied it was all right because they just loved the food and only wanted him to take care of the orders now. When the two left the restaurant, her sister sighed, saying she just wanted a nice lunch, and those others had ruined it. Ju-kyung replied that it was fine because the food was delicious. Finally, the two part ways because her sister had to work now. When she got home, the protagonist felt full and thought she should go to the restaurant again. Thinking about it, the restaurant owner was really handsome, even with a scar on his face. Suddenly, she receives a message from Sujin, asking if she was around because it was Saturday. Ju-kyung replies that she wasn't doing anything, and Sujin suggests they go out for coffee, making her excited to go on a hangout, even knowing they were quite different. Their level of beauty was completely different. Standing next to a beauty like her would make her look like an ugly witch. Still, the protagonist prepares herself anyway. She does her makeup quickly, and Ju-kyung wonders if it's too obvious that she tried hard, but it doesn't matter because she would definitely look ugly next to someone like Sujin. Then the protagonist leaves home to meet Sujin, who was already receiving various compliments and glances at her and her body. Even Ju-kyung feels she was a truly stunning woman. She stood out among all the other people around, yet Sujin ran up and grabbed the protagonist's arm, smiling, commenting that she was really tall for a woman. She mentions she's about 1.70 meters, and Sujin is impressed. There was only a 1 centimeter difference between them, but they were practically the same height. The two go out together, and Sujin keeps glancing at Ju-kyung, noticing that her makeup was really heavy, her skin texture was terrible, and her body was quite plain. Sujin says she'll order an herbal tea and comments on how good Ju-kyung was at makeup, curious to know what she used under her eyes because it looked so beautiful. She only had time to put on lipstick and felt ugly next to Ju-kyung, but the protagonist responds that Sujin was prettier than her, practically a goddess on earth. The two take selfies, with Ju-kyung unable to believe she was experiencing this moment. It was like a dream, until they finish the outing and return home when night falls. At home, the protagonist feels happy because she was complimented by a pretty girl until she receives notifications from Kang asking if Ji-byung saw the photos posted on social media. Kang explains that only Sujin's photo was edited, and the comments were even more ridiculous, comparing the two and clearly trying to ridicule Ji-byung. Even though the protagonist was honored to have taken photos together, suddenly Sujin messages, asking if she'd be interested in meeting a guy who liked her. The protagonist immediately gets excited, surprised by the blind date proposal, but meeting a guy with a face like hers felt like she was reaching beyond her limits. She just wanted to say no and thanks Soojin for the message, but thought it wasn't enough. Even so, Soojin insists that she's really beautiful and would send her the guy's social media. So Joo Gi-young receives the notification for the guy's profile, realizing it's someone named Woo Young-ji who had some photos posted on his profile. However, in none of them could the protagonist see his face, but he looked incredible in them, making her want to meet him. So she agrees with Soojin's proposal by message. Soojin sighs, noticing that she liked what she saw. Perhaps Joo Gi-young would like a guy at her own level and should know her place now. Soojin thinks that all Joo Gi-young should do was disappear from her life. She then calls Ji, as she received the protagonist's number, and would send it now because it seemed Joo Gi-young was interested, wishing him good luck. A bit later, Joo Gi-young is shocked because Jae sent her a message and they greet each other, with him commenting that it was also his first time talking about this. He typed politely, making her tremble with nervousness. Ji asks if they could meet up as she's free that weekend, leaving her super excited. She couldn't believe something like this could actually happen, so she quickly decides to look for new clothes for her date. At school, she tells her friends about it. They're obviously interested, as it seemed Jae was a college student with a perfect vibe. Still, it was strange because they couldn't see his face in any of his photos on social media. Nevertheless, they wish the protagonist good luck on her date because it would definitely be amazing if they started dating. If he's as handsome as he seems, they would be so jealous of Joo Gi-young. They just want to know all the updates as much as possible. Finally, the weekend arrives along with the alarm for the much-anticipated day of her date with Jae. Joo Gi-young applied a mask the night before just for that night, thinking she might try the date makeup she saw on a blog the other day and like. First, sunscreen. Prevention was crucial to avoid spots. Next was foundation. She blushed easily, so she chose a green-toned base to apply. Before applying foundation, it was time for her secret weapon, high-coverage concealer. She could use it to get rid of dark circles and small blemishes, then use brightening powder. Just a light tap for the powder. For her eyebrows, she'd use a brush-like pencil for a natural look. Double eyelid tape was absolutely necessary, just a light touch then. With the eyelash curler, she'd skip mascara and add a bit of eyeliner at the ends without applying any shimmery shadow. For lenses, she'd wear simple brown ones. With the right size, she chose the coral shade for her lips, a slightly darker rose inside her lips, and now she was ready, feeling even better than usual about herself. She ran to ask her brother how she looked, and he complained because she entered without knocking first, only to push her out even though Joo Gi-young was just teasing him a bit. That's when she realized she was late and needed to hurry. She ran to the spot where Jae hadn't arrived yet, but it was perfect because she could calm down and check things over. It seemed everything was perfect, but even though she looked fine before leaving home, it still felt like she'd worn too much makeup. Then Jae himself appeared, asking for her. Joo Gi-young was in shock. He was even more attractive in person, making her shy to even look into his eyes, and he smiled, asking if she had eaten anything. They could get something for her to eat, and he asked what she felt like having since they could pick something special for their first date that day. Joo Gi-young agreed, thinking he was really thoughtful, and they went to a place to eat and ordered. She couldn't help but think Ji was stunning to look at. She worried that he might regret meeting her in person, but he complimented her, saying she had big, beautiful eyes, making her blush. Even if it was all thanks to the lenses and makeup, they ate together, enjoying their noodles and making Ji laugh. Joo Gi-young wondered if she'd overdone it with the food. He offered her a taste of his pizza, and she asked what his blood type was. He replied that she should guess, and when she couldn't, he revealed he was type O. She laughed nervously because she was type A, thinking she must have looked silly, showing her gums while smiling like that. Then they decided to go somewhere else. This time they went to a cafe, and Ji told her she didn't need to act so formal around him since he was only a year older than her, and Joo Gi-young agreed. They went for an iced coffee and an Americano, and she decided to pay for the drinks this time. Time passed until it was finally time for them to part ways and head home. The protagonist went to the station to catch her train, thinking it was a shame they had to say goodbye so soon, and saw him waving goodbye. She thought he was even better than she'd imagined. He messaged her to take care and let him know when she got home. Joo Gi-young was pleased, feeling like things had gone well. At this pace, there might be some hope for this relationship to work out. At home, she reflected on everything that happened. Jae seemed really nice, not to mention polite. He was only a year older but was very mature. That's when he messaged, asking if Joo Gi-young enjoyed the date, saying he had a great time. He also asked if she had plans for the following Wednesday, which was a holiday, surprising her since he'd already invited her for another date. She replied that she had no plans. Then he suggested they could go see a movie. Ju-kyung was thrilled because it felt like a green light for the relationship to progress even further over time. On Wednesday, the protagonist was trembling with excitement. She put in her limited edition colored contacts, saving them specifically for a special occasion like this. She was about to head out in 20 minutes, so she decided to take some selfies. That's when she received a message from Ji, apologizing because he was feeling unwell and would have to skip the date. The protagonist sighed in disappointment but understood his side. At school, Ju-kyung felt down, and Kang asked what was wrong because she seemed really sad. It was just because the protagonist had sent messages to Ji, but he hadn't replied. Little did she know that this guy was actually dating several other girls besides Ju-kyung. Jae went out with his friends to the club to share everything that had happened, laughing about the girls he dated because they really fell for the stupid lines he used on each of them. They were all very easy girls to win over, and he shows Ju-kyung's picture to his friends, asking what they thought of her. His friends noticed she was a high school girl. He laughs, thinking he could keep seeing Ju-kyung. She was still in high school, but it was fine because he paid for things with his own money and all that. However, he quickly shifts his attention to a short-haired girl who passed by, already getting up eagerly to try his luck with her and enjoy his night. His friends bet money that Ji's phone would be off later, betting he would get rejected right away, and so he spends his time hitting on that girl. Meanwhile, Ju-kyung worries because she hasn't heard from Ji since then. He hasn't read her messages even though he's been online all the time on social media these days. She wonders how he could have so many friends, and they were all amazing girls. A flight attendant, a model, even a nurse, all very attractive women. Before, the protagonist thought they had a good time together, but maybe he lost interest because she wasn't Ji's type, leaving her frustrated and a little hurt afterward. The next day, she receives a message from him apologizing because he's been really busy, and Ju-kyung feels quite happy, thinking she was right to wait. She asks how he's been, and he replies that he's fine, which relieves her because he was responding right away, and she asks when they could see each other again. However, once again he ignores her, and the protagonist convinces herself he must be busy again. The next day, Ju-kyung approaches Soo-jin to talk. Soo-jin asks how things are going with Ji, and the protagonist explains that he hasn't read her messages even though he's always online, and Soo-jin laughs, saying she should know how it is. After all, college students are always quite busy, but there's no need to worry, things should go well. Ju-kyung agrees and thanks her for the advice. Soo-jin tries to console her, thinking to herself how naive Ju-kyung is. Time passes, and Ju-kyung keeps waiting for the opportunity to send him another message. When she finally does, he responds, apologizing because he was with his group of friends and couldn't check his phone, suggesting they could meet on Friday night. The protagonist gets excited because she finally has some good news, and as the night before the big day arrives, she wonders what his type might be and what would attract him. He probably liked classy girls, so Ju-kyung prepares everything for the date. But when she went to class the next day, her friends were shocked by her hair. After all, she changed her hairstyle, and though they try to say it's fine, it looks odd. Time passes, and Ju-kyung gets excited when class ends. Now she could finally see Ji again, but even after almost half an hour, he hasn't responded. She decides to call him, but Jae is busy with another girl in bed. The girl mentions that his phone is ringing, and he replies that it's just his sister, and she shouldn't worry about it. So once again, Ju-kyung is left waiting another day. This leaves her hurt, because it seems she'll never meet a truly good guy. She gets up and stays at school until the next day, when she gets another message from Ji. He apologizes for the third time and suggests going out that day, but Ju-kyung can't believe he's serious, and she goes on the date anyway. Annoyed, she feels like a fool, and although she wants to take her anger out on him, she completely loses the chance when she sees Ji in person that day after everything. Even though he always ignored her, he was still a sweet guy, and Ju-kyung wonders what he really wanted after all. After the day passes and their date ends, Ji asks if she would like to be his girlfriend, whispering that they're now a couple, making Ju-kyung happy because she now has a boyfriend for the first time in her life. During the study group, the protagonist tells Kang all about it and that she's dating, even happily showing them taking pictures together and posting them on social media. She also shows Lee, who remains quiet and serious, saying nothing, and Kang complains because he's really boring but now jealous of the protagonist. She also wanted to date someone, so they continue studying, and time passes until a week later, when Lee is walking through the streets casually without thinking much. He ends up passing by Ji, who was out with another girl that night, and he turns, realizing he recognizes this guy's face, shocked to discover the harsh truth. He approaches Ji, visibly furious as he realizes that Jae has been deceiving Joo-hyung all this time. A little after the tense encounter between Lee and Ji, the young man called Soo-jin to tell her everything that had happened, and she complained because he ruined the whole situation this time. He replied that he obviously didn't do it on purpose. He was tired enough now, they should talk later, and he simply hung up on her, leaving her calling out for him. Frustrated, Soo-jin couldn't believe the jerk hung up on her. She hated how nothing ever went her way. That idiot only had one job and still managed to mess it up. She threw her phone against the wall, cursing, while the protagonist lay on her bed with her own phone. There was no better place than an online forum to vent. She wrote that she hadn't heard from her boyfriend in a week. They'd been dating for 2 weeks, but it had been a week since he stopped reading her messages. He even ignored her on social media. She didn't feel anything unusual the last day they met, so she asked if she did something wrong and what she should do now. Some responses said he must have led her on, that it must be frustrating, and they hoped she wouldn't be traumatized. Others had dated people like that, and he probably went for someone else. The protagonist was surprised by the idea that he might be avoiding her, sighing because she must have indeed been discarded. Reflecting, she realized he was always surrounded by other girls. She was never good enough. She bet he could find others more beautiful and interesting. She cringed at the thought, yet it was still so cruel to be ghosted. He could at least have told her it was over, but abandoning her like that without saying anything was rude. Then Joo-hyung sighed, realizing she'd always been fooling herself. She could never have a real boyfriend. She knew a thing or two about makeup, but she wasn't a supermodel, and her body wasn't exactly amazing or particularly attractive, and she wasn't the most noticeable person. She thought she didn't have anything other girls didn't have better. No one could find her attractive, much less choose her in life. She cried, thinking about this and lamenting how pathetic she was. The next day, even after using enough barley tea, her face was still quite swollen from the tears. Her paths crossed with Soo-jin, who asked if she was still dating Ji, and Joo-hyung thought it was a shame to tell her the truth, as she was the one who introduced them. So, she stammered that it really hadn't worked out, their schedules were too different, but she thanked her anyway for the opportunity, which left Soo-jin irritated. After all, the protagonist didn't seem the least bit shaken, and she sympathized, saying that Joo-hyung was too good for him anyway. She was too sweet and pretty for him. She deserved an even better guy, which made Joo-hyung quite happy to hear. Soo-jin said she should forget about it and suggested they do something fun over the weekend to distract her. Joo-hyung wondered what she had in mind, and Soo-jin mentioned a really popular cafe she knew where they could take the best photos of their lives. At this, the protagonist agreed, leaving Soo-jin quite excited. In the classroom, Kang asked her friend if she was okay, and the protagonist agreed with a forced and nervous laugh. She just needed to focus on studying because, after all, she was a senior. Kang agreed. It wasn't like she and Ji had been dating long enough to get too attached. Still, Joo-hyung didn't need to pretend she wasn't affected, and after confirming she was fine, he asked if she knew they would be receiving their exam scores that very day, and they were the practical exams. An wanted to compare the questions, and they would probably be dead by Saturday after that. The protagonist sighed upon hearing. She was in big trouble, her grades were terrible, and she had to hide it no matter what. When Saturday arrived, the protagonist sighed, lying on her bed. She was feeling a bit down because nothing was going right. Her life was hitting rock bottom. She wasn't feeling well, so she decided to text, saying she wouldn't be going out. Even though she was supposed to meet up with a study group, she didn't feel well, and despite not being proud of it, she had no choice and didn't want to think about anything else at this point. Suddenly, her mother burst into her room, questioning whether Joo-hyung should be studying that day and wanting to know why she was still lying in bed, looking so lazy. But she just turned away, mumbling for her mom to leave her alone, and her mom approached, forcing her to get up and study right now. She couldn't just sit around like that. She at least had to hurry to try to get into college, asking if she wasn't even a bit inspired after her own older sister also got into university. Joo-hyung complains that her mother was too unfair and asks how she could always blame her, never saying anything to Young, even though his grades were worse than hers. Her mother responds that she couldn't dare to compare herself to him when she wasn't even talented at anything, and all she did was spread garbage everywhere with her face. She should throw it all away because it wouldn't bring her any future. Ju-young mutters in agreement, saying she would go to college, and tells her mom to get off her back now that she's said it. Then she slams the door after running away from her mother. Even after leaving the house, she didn't have anywhere to really go, and she wonders what kind of person she would become now. There was nothing she wanted in life, and she wasn't good at anything special. She wonders why she needed to go to college. It would be the same routine, and she'd be just as bad at her studies. Nothing would change this way. She hated her own life, so she decides to go read some comics at the bookstore after this moment of reflection, where suddenly a voice whispers, scaring her. That's when she realizes it was Lee who had spoken to her. Ju-young wonders how he could be there every day, and after Lee comments that she should be sick. Just as he had said in his message, she stammers that she was sick but felt better now, though she gets nervous because he was giving her that piercing look again. The protagonist avoids eye contact until Lee asks if she was really feeling okay, and she replies that she is. Then the two go outside to talk and sit on the park bench. There, he asks how she did on the practical exam, and Ju-young hesitates to answer because he wanted to know about her grades, but seeing her hesitant and distant reaction makes him sigh, asking if she only joined the study group to go out or something. At least she should have said if she finished the hiragana session and improved a bit in it. Time and time again, he questions if she really wanted to go to college when she hadn't even studied. Ju-young recoils because she couldn't stand hearing the same questions anymore. She stammers that she needed to get into college. Otherwise, her family would treat her like human trash, but she didn't know if she could get into a university with grades like hers. He replies that she just needed to study, and she agrees, but the problem was that Japanese wasn't the only subject. She was terrible at every possible subject, and it was complicated. Sighing, Lee asks how she could go to college like this, but since she was serious about it, he says they should first start by choosing which one she'd want to get into. Then they could start with 2 hours in the school's study room. After hours, just the two of them. Ju-young asks about the others, and he replies that everyone got good grades on the tests. She understands and says he didn't have to do this, but she thanks him for the effort. Then she gets up because she needed to get back before her mother started worrying. After a moment, Lee asks how things were with her boyfriend, and Ju-young is surprised, replying that he probably wouldn't want to know because it was a disaster. She'd never be able to have a real relationship, but he says it should be one less thing to worry about, and Ju-young agrees, still a bit downcast, and says goodbye to him. The next day, the protagonist woke up with someone sending a message very early. She realized it was Sujin asking if she hadn't forgotten their meeting that day. Ju-young jumps out of bed upon realizing they had indeed planned it. Meanwhile, Sujin was getting ready to go out and noticed her parents were arguing again. She turns up the volume on her phone to drown out the yelling with music, and a bit later, Ju-young heads out to meet her in the streets and approaches to greet her. She's caught by surprise because she was even more beautiful than before. It seemed like photos could never come close to how she really looked. The protagonist had to acknowledge it. She could never wear clothes like that, showing off the body, and didn't even know what she should focus on. Sujin wonders what Ju-young was thinking about so suddenly, standing still. At least she wasn't almost embarrassing her. Then the protagonist compliments her, and she replies that Ju-young was even more so. She'd seen many girls on social media, but she stood out. The protagonist felt a bit more proud after all the effort put into her makeup. Suddenly, a boy appears, asking for permission because he'd like to get her number, and offers his phone to her. Sujin sighs because, as usual, this happened. It was a cute boy, but he approached in such a cliched way, she would refuse a few times before giving it. However, he was offering his phone to Ju-young, leaving her a bit shocked because there must have been a mistake. Maybe he forgot his glasses at home to be talking to her. She asked why he wanted her phone, but he confirmed that was exactly it. The protagonist stammered an apology, saying she wasn't dating anyone right now, but she was still in high school, and he agreed, saying he understood and apologizing again. Even surprised, Sujin commented to Ju-young that it was really incredible just now, and she looked really beautiful. Still, she thought he wasn't even that handsome. It was such poor taste. They decided to go out for a drink, and Sujin was a bit shocked because it was quite an expensive place. She mentioned she had forgotten her wallet at home and only had her bus fare, and Ju-young responded that it was fine because she could pay for her now. It wasn't a problem. The protagonist was surprised because it was truly an amazing place. They didn't call that neighborhood wealthy for nothing. The two sat in a silence that made her uncomfortable, sighing. She had to say something, but she didn't know what to talk about with Sujin until Sujin herself asked Jugyong to lend her lip tint, and she agreed, opening her bag immediately. Offering her makeup bag, she mentioned it wasn't anything special, but Sujin was welcome to use whatever she wanted. Sujin excused herself to pick what she needed. Surprised because she only used cheap makeup, Juvyong observed that her skin was really perfect. She couldn't even see her pores. It looked flawless. It made her feel envious, and Sujin commented she was surprised by how much makeup Jugyong had, like a master of techniques. She herself was terrible at it and wanted some lessons one day. Jugyong replied that she would look beautiful even without makeup, and Sujin feigned innocence, saying she wished she could do makeup like the protagonist and asked her to teach her. She was only using BB cream and lip tint that day. She thought makeup was too difficult, leaving Jugyong a bit pressured because she said Sujin would look beautiful just as she was. Again, they fell into silence, and the protagonist asked how her body could be so good, wanting to know if she followed any diet, and Sujin confirmed she did it every day. Even if you're born perfect, you could never stay that way without exercise. She did 200 squats a day, plus yoga and sometimes swimming, always whatever she could. This surprised Jugyong because she never knew Sujin worked so hard, and Sujin asked if she liked clothes. She loved fashion and was thinking of opening an online store afterward. When she graduated, the protagonist was impressed that she had already decided on her career just now, and she thought it could all work out since Sujin also had the right profile for it. She still didn't know what she wanted for the future, but Sujin was always impressive. She herself laughed, saying there was no need to rush. She should just discover it at her own pace. And she got up to go to the bathroom, excusing herself. Meanwhile, Juvyong thought it was surprising because while Sujin could do 200 squats, she herself couldn't even come close to 20, doing exercises while eating only fried chicken and pizza. And speaking of self-control, it was something she lacked, even though she had decided what to do in life. She was truly admirable, and she considered that she should start exercising too. Not that she could ever reach Sujin's level, but she could try starting something like that. When Sujin returned, she caught Jugyong off guard, suggesting they could take some selfies because she had an app that did wonders, taking the opportunity to snap several photos. However, to Sujin's surprise, two girls appeared in the background, and she recognized them, wondering what they were doing there, which made her start trembling, stuttering for them to leave. A voice approached, asking if it was really Sujin, even as she mentally begged them not to come closer. Yet, they still approached and immediately recognized her. It was quite a coincidence to see her there again, and she laughed nervously, agreeing. The girls asked if Jugyong was a new friend. She was indeed very pretty, and it made sense. The prettiest girls should always be together, the protagonist thought, impressed that they must be other friends of Sujin. They were all very attractive and wore expensive things, and only branded items. They didn't even look like high school students. The girls complimented Sujin, saying she was even more beautiful than before when they studied together. They also loved her social media posts and invited her to go out or call anytime. They kept commenting on the things they had and how they were similar, which only made Sujin more nervous, and even Jugyong felt uncomfortable and excused herself to go to the bathroom, feeling the pressure, but to her surprise, she overheard things. The same two girls who had praised Sujin earlier were now insulting her because she was showing off, laughing behind her back, and criticizing the same clothes and accessories they had complimented before. They looked like fake clothes. They were pathetic outfits with no style. The protagonist wonders how they could say such things after pretending to be friends with Sujin just a moment ago. She decides it would be better to wait until they leave. Finally, the protagonist returns, and Sujin gives a slight smile, apologizing because she needs to go home now as something came up. Even though she wanted to stay longer, it was a shame to leave so soon, but the protagonist says it's okay because she had a lot of fun that day and they could go. She didn't know what had happened earlier, but those so-called friends of Sujin were awful people when they talked behind her back in such a rude and fake way. She wonders what kind of friends they were, how they could be so cruel after acting so friendly like that. Sujin would surely be hurt if she found out about it. That night, Sujin returned home thinking the whole day had gone badly, and she recalls the times she spent with her former friends, sighing because it only made her feel worse. She was then confronted by her mother, who grabbed her by the hair, demanding to know where she'd been all day. If she had so much free time, she should get a job to pay for her mom's drinking. The smell of alcohol made Sujin feel sick, and she complains that even though the doctor had told her not to drink, she did it anyway, and her mother yells at her not to talk to her that way. She'd leave that house someday to learn her lesson, so Sujin runs and locks herself in her room, trying to ignore the yelling. She calls up and makes a call to someone. She asks if she could meet that person soon. That someone was Lee, whom she met a little later at a cafe to talk with him. Lee asks what she wanted, and Sujin asks him not to be so cold. She just wanted to see him, and she's curious to know what he's drinking because she might order the same thing. When he receives multiple notifications, she comments on it and asks who it was, reaching out to grab his phone, but he takes it first and keeps it away from her. He mentions how she had said earlier she would buy something to eat, and Sujin stammers, agreeing she'll be back soon, though she's still curious about the messages. She was sure he wasn't dating, but she still wanted to know who was sending those messages, especially to make him laugh like that, which she rarely saw. Then she returns asking who the messages were from and who the amazing girl was that made him so happy. Changing the subject, Lee asks why she called him there. Sujin replies she just wanted to see him, and he gets up, asking if they could end it now because he's leaving since he has nothing to say to her now that they've met. Still, Sujin asks him to stay, and it looked like he was really leaving like that. She sighs because it was all so embarrassing and wonders what she did wrong now. Not knowing why everyone always treats her this way, her head was aching. Meanwhile, Ju-hyun wonders how Sujin must be doing. She hadn't seemed well earlier. Something must have happened between her and those supposed friends, and she decides to check social media to see if she had posted anything and notices a photo from before. The protagonist feels relieved because Sujin had posted it. She was worried for nothing and was glad she had fun when they went out together. Now it only made her more determined to exercise. She starts doing squats, and the next day her legs were sore, even though she hadn't done that many, just for one night, and she finds Kang in a similar situation. On says she went to a concert the previous day and totally lost it. Ju-hyun asks if she stood the whole time, and Kang agrees because she did it all excitedly. She didn't mind being a senior. It was the best day of her life, and she was thrilled because she went all out. On jokes, asking what kind of high schooler did that. It was a boy band concert. They were cute, but she couldn't understand why she liked them so much. Kang replies that she was completely clueless and didn't know anything, and shows their faces. They were electrifying, handsome, cool, and great performers. There was no other group like them, suggesting they should get into the wave before it's too late. And she suggested that she could help them get into this world, offering some notebooks and other items she received from the show since they were her best friends and just had to promise to take care of everything with love. In the end, after all that, the protagonist went on with her day, still feeling tired and hungry from all the effort. She passed by Lee, who reminded her that they should head to the library, and she agreed, realizing she'd need to study again after everything. Lee asked why her backpack was so heavy, saying it felt like she was carrying rocks, so he took it upon himself to carry it for her, allowing her to go hands-free. Even though Ju-hyun mentioned it was really heavy, she wondered why he was being so nice all of a sudden, but in any case, they headed to the library together. She noticed she'd brought along the notebook that Kang had given her, surprised because all the guys in it were really handsome. They all looked very attractive. They even wore makeup. Their hair and clothes were cute too. When he noticed she was quite distracted, Lee asked what she was doing. Ju-hyun told him she'd gotten it from Kang and mentioned that she thought he would look good with one of those hairstyles, but he just told her to get back to studying and focus on what mattered. At home, the protagonist noticed that boy bands used all kinds of different makeup, and Ju-hyun ran to see her brother in his room, who complained again because she never knocked. She apologized and asked him to come over for a moment, preparing him because she wanted to use him for makeup practice. As long as he helped her, she could buy him fried chicken, and all he had to do was sit still, which kept her brother quiet, while Ju-hyun noticed that Young had large eyes and a small jaw. She could try making him look like a member with a similar face shape. First, she applied foundation, then matte shadow around the eyes. Layers of deep colors on the outer corners. Trimmed eyebrows were also important, some shading to enhance angles, and lip tint was a must. Especially for boy band members, blending the color outward was suitable. When Ju-hyun finished, she was surprised because her younger brother really looked different. The boy was curious to see and was surprised that he looked really different, then went to show his older sister, asking if he could join a boy band now. She asked what was wrong with that idiot, leaving Ju-hyung smiling because men's makeup was quite fun too. It didn't turn out that bad. Even as a beginner, she thought she should try different styles. Sometime later, Ju-hyung woke up on Saturday with a study session planned for that day. She just wanted to sleep, but received several notifications from the study group saying that no one could make it that day, and it seemed like everyone except Lee was going. It looked like the two of them might meet alone, and Ju-hyung didn't need to wear makeup either, so she went to the meeting spot, but he hadn't arrived yet. Then he showed up, catching Ju-hyung totally by surprise because he had a new hairstyle, reminding her it was the one she'd suggested last time. She started laughing a little, asking who he was, and he blushed, telling her to open the book to review, but he really did look like a celebrity dressed like that now. He really could look better than most boy bands, so they went out together, and Ju-hyung asked if he had other plans, suggesting they could stop by a convenience store. The two went to get something to eat, and she complained that she'd picked something too spicy, deciding to buy a soda to pass the time, while little did she know her older sister was nearby. Her sister was coming back from work, feeling bad, because the CEO always started drinking in the early afternoon, and she wanted to grab one of those hangover drinks before heading home. When she entered the convenience store, she saw Lee just as Ju-hyung returned with juice for him too, finding her sister talking to him and introducing herself. She asked if he'd be interested in doing an audition for her entertainment agency, but she nearly vomited as the protagonist realized it was her sister who appeared out of nowhere. She handed her sister a bag to throw up in, not understanding what was happening so suddenly, but it looked like Lee was equally shocked and ready to freak out about the scene. At that, Ju-hyung had no choice but to tell him she really had to go now, asking him to pretend this never happened, and he replied that it was all fine. And he asks if they don't need to stop by the pharmacy first, but the protagonist says it's not necessary anymore, bidding him farewell as she helps her sister get home in that state. Then, her sister asks exactly who Ju-hyung is, since she isn't a stranger and even looks familiar. The protagonist can't believe her sister drank so much to the point of forgetting her. Her sister jokes that she looked like a rice cake. It didn't take long for the two of them to get home, and the protagonist put her sister to bed. Almost exhausted after everything she had to do, especially embarrassed and unsure how she should face Lee after this incident, her older sister managed to ruin everything. Still, Ju-hyung hadn't been able to hear what they were talking about before getting closer. Meanwhile, Lee had her sister's agency card. He puts the card away, and the next day her sister is nursing a headache from a hangover, and Ju-hyung greets her, sulking, while she asks how she got home. The protagonist is shocked because her sister really didn't remember anything, and she responds that she doesn't, but she thinks she saw a very handsome guy on the way home and might have been hallucinating. For now, Ju-hyung just hands over the soup she made for them, grumbling about her sister's hangover, even as her older sister complains about it. A bit later, Ju-hyung is forced to go out to buy a snack for her sister, wondering what she did to deserve such sorrow in her life, but at least she could enjoy it, and also buy a burger for herself to eat. That's when she notices two guys who cut in line in front of her, just staring at Ju-hyung, who wasn't wearing makeup. This makes her step back because she couldn't refuse at this point. She considers the options of chicken or cheese sandwiches and wonders if she should add even more now. She sees a couple coming down the stairs, talking about how he made her spill ice cream on herself, and he promises he'll buy her another one. Ju-hyung thinks she could have bought differently. A large soda wasn't a good choice. She couldn't even finish all of it, and on top of that, she manages to slip and send everything flying to the cafeteria floor. Falling to her knees and hurting herself, she hears a yell asking who did that and realizes she ended up spilling everything on the guys who had cut in line before, who are now outraged. They ask if she's crazy after spilling everything on them, and she's shocked to be called ma'am and doesn't even know how to get out of this situation. They threaten her, and Ju-hyung apologizes, offering to pay for their laundry bill, but even that isn't enough until a young man steps in to stop the argument. After all, he bought that shirt for only $5, and it wasn't even worth that much money. In the end, the guys leave, saying it was indeed Ju-hyung's lucky day. Even so, she felt relieved and wonders why the floor was so slippery to this extent. Next to her, someone asks if she's okay because her knees are bleeding. At home, the protagonist laments being all bruised up after that embarrassing experience. She always seemed to manage to trip or bump into something accidentally. She couldn't even understand why she was always so clumsy. That day was painful and even more embarrassing. The previous day had also been true torture. Her life was one big problem. The next day, Ju-Young goes to class with her knees still hurting, feeling bad and craving a soda. She heads to the cafeteria, where many people are chatting. Among the students is the young man from the cafeteria who helped her, and the students are happy because they haven't seen him in a long time, and now he's appeared again. That's when Ju-Young enters the cafeteria and recognizes who he is, but now she realizes she's wearing makeup, and it's not a good idea to draw attention in this way. She just tries to play it off by pointing to the other guy near him, changing the subject and attempting to cover her initial surprise with a completely different topic. And he even attended her school. How had she never seen him before? That's when Lee appears, asking about her, but just passes by Ju-Young to order a juice. The protagonist questions how he could be buying red ginseng juice, saying it seemed like something an old man would buy, then mentions she came to get a soda. And she remembers the chaos of the previous day, immediately not wanting to think about it, and decides to switch to apple juice instead. Lee asks what happened to her injured knees. She says she tripped the day before, and he notices she seems to need new bandages, offering them to her, and Ju-Young thanks him for that, asking him to forget what happened. From when they met on Saturday, he just asked if her sister was okay, and she agreed, saying she had just drunk a little too much that day, as usual. Once again, Ju-Young ended up seeing that guy from the other day, shocked because he had been in the other room just a moment ago, and she walked past him, but the guy spoke to them. Or rather, to Lee, commenting that things had changed a lot for him, which made Ju-Young curious because it seemed like these two guys knew each other and had some history. The two stared at each other, and the guy asked if Lee was trying to act serious in front of a girl now, getting close until Lee grabbed him by the shirt collar, irritated, making him laugh. He was really an aggressive guy, and he asked what Lee's problem was, seeming too angry to think straight. The guy kept provoking him because he seemed really serious now. He taunted him to hit him right there, causing people in the hallway to gossip among themselves, saying a fight was about to start, and everyone gathered to watch, curious. It was between Lee and Seojin, and Seojin kept provoking him to hit him, asking if his girlfriend even knew he was a ridiculous loser or not. Ju-Young wondered what was going on, not understanding what Seojin's problem was or whether she should really stop them or just leave it for them to handle. Unsure what to do, she just watched until Lee let him go. Seojin laughed, saying he knew he couldn't do it because he was a coward, and Ju-Young said that was enough, they should go now. For the time being, she just helped him leave as they ignored Seojin, leaving him behind, right when Seojin appeared, grabbing his arm and asking why he was in such a bad mood. Seojin pulled his arm away, telling her not to touch him, and asked since when that idiot got himself a girlfriend. She asked what he was talking about, as Lee didn't have a real girlfriend. Then Seojin asked who that girl was, and Seojin explained that she was just a friend, which seemed ridiculous too, because it didn't seem like Lee could even have friends in life. Meanwhile, Ju-Young felt tense, wondering why he was so angry. She had never seen him like that before and had no idea what to do or say to Lee now. Then they stopped at the nurse's office, and he told her to wait right there while he got some bandages, and she agreed, wondering what the two had been talking about earlier. Time passed and classes ended. Kang ran over to tell the protagonist that a new coca had opened downtown and they should go check it out. Ju-Young asked what that was. An explained it was a karaoke, and Kang said she'd heard the place was full of handsome guys and was going to skip her class to check it out. An sighed, saying that was all she thought about. She was really something, but she agreed to go with Kang anyway. Even though Ju-Young said she didn't know how to sing, her friends didn't mind because it was just them. She didn't even need to sing if she didn't want to. They could just hang out and have fun together. So they went to the karaoke and were shocked because it was full of guys indeed. But they were anything but handsome, and they wondered where all the good-looking guys they had heard about had gone. Still, they decided to just sit down and enjoy singing together in the room. Ju-Young realized it had been a long time since she last went to karaoke. They started by choosing a song, and her friends sang along, with the protagonist blushing. It was so embarrassing to watch, and An said she needed water, and Ju-Young noticed they were out of drinks. Even Kang was exhausted after singing and wanted to take a break. She hadn't even started on her favorite songs yet and decided to reserve some, asking why the protagonist wasn't singing, but thinking they could reserve a song for her. Kang paused for a moment to comment that someone in the next booth sounded a lot like Sam Smith, really someone with a professional voice. The friends told Jugyong to peek and see who it was, and apparently, several other girls had come out to do the same, surprised by the guy. The protagonist was amazed because people had come running to see who was singing. Meanwhile, she decided to buy 3 drinks for her friends and head back. However, when she returned, the girls watching the guy sing were gone. As she approached to see what happened, a door opened and hit Jugyong, causing her to drop the drink on the floor. She apologized and bent down to pick up the drink until she noticed that the person who had come out of the booth was Seojin, and the two stared at each other in shock. She immediately recognized him as the jerk. Then, both of them turned their faces to the other sides. The protagonist felt nervous and sensed it was a pretty awkward situation, so she just decided to go back to her booth, not understanding anything. She wondered if Seojin was the singer with such a good voice. It was impressive. That night, Jugyong reflects that those two must have had a story in the past. It wasn't like she could ask either of them anyway. The next day, she went to the cafeteria with her friends, and Kang laughs, mentioning that her voice was completely gone. On laughs, saying that Jugyong has to sing at least one song next time they go to karaoke, and she nervously agrees because they know how to throw a party. Suddenly, it's Seojin himself who sits with them, leaving Jugyong a bit shocked and wondering what he wanted now. But when he looked at her knees, she wonders if he had figured out her true identity and who she really was behind that makeup. But before she could ask if he needed something, he just stood up to leave, ignoring Jugyong, and her friends asked if he wasn't the guy who almost fought with Lee the other day, the one who never goes to school. Everyone is left not understanding what just happened, just shivering without knowing if she had been recognized or not, without understanding why she always had to run into them. She couldn't stop thinking about it, not understanding why Seojin just looked and got up without saying anything. Deep down, it might not be anything worth worrying about. Meanwhile, Seojin was wondering where he knew Jugyong's name from until he crossed paths with a woman named Hyegyong, who surprised him. He says she had to handle something and should have mentioned that she went to this school since it had been so long since he last saw her. He was actually someone he could call, his boss too, and she tells him to talk about things in his life because things seem to be going really well. He looked tall enough to become a model. Seojin sighs, saying he couldn't become a model, although she insists he has great potential. Then he waves goodbye, saying he can always call her, suggesting they should go out to eat sometime and that she could get in touch with him. That's when Jugyong, his sister, approaches, asking what that was all about, not knowing how she knew Seojin, who was such a big jerk, and he responds that she doesn't need to worry about knowing, asking her to go straight home afterward. Jugyong denies it, saying she needs to go to the library to study, and he laughs, saying she seems to be making an effort to get good grades, and just leaves after talking to her. A bit later, Mr. Han shows up in the classroom, instantly charming all the girls, and he asks everyone to calm down because they still needed to start class. During the class, the teacher notices Jugyong dozing off and calls her name, making her jump awake startled, and he says that since everyone seems a bit tired that day, he'll buy ice cream for them, making all the students cheer, and he even offers one to the protagonist, surprising her a bit to receive it. She's left wondering why she received something like this from Mr. Han, and Kang complains that it wasn't fair and she wanted one too, and he replies that the popsicle suits her, leaving her indignant while the teacher laughs because the popsicles were delicious too. But Jugyong still found everything strange because the teacher was acting very different. He'd never treated her like that before, and the next day, this continued, with Han offering her a book that would help her with her studies, and the same thing happened again the next day. He also offered her a soda, and Kang kept suggesting that he might have a crush on her, but it seemed impossible to the protagonist, though it left her a bit charmed. If it were true, it was crazy. Juhyong rolls on her bed and decides to see what the tarot cards have to say. The phone screen shows she needs to pick 3 cards. In the deck, it talks about her future relationship, saying she'll have good luck in love, that men will be around her, and that she shouldn't search too far because her match is close. This only convinces her more that it must be true about Han, closer than she thought. If it were the teacher, she didn't know what to do because she was just a student. Then, the reading also warns her that there's another person, and she might face a love triangle soon, which doesn't sound good to Juhyong. It smelled like trouble. Suddenly, she received a message from Han, saying he was near her house and asking if she had a minute to talk, leaving her completely shocked. He had shown up at her house so suddenly that it made Ju-gyung think the tarot cards might be right. It gave her goosebumps, and she wasn't sure if she should go out to see him. She might be mistaken too, which only made her more nervous than before, so Ju-gyung hesitated and tried to take a moment to think and not let her emotions take over. First, she needed to take care of her oily skin. She would have to meet him naturally. She also put on her contact lenses and finally left the house after saying goodbye to her mom. When she arrived, Ju-gyung had her hair naturally tied up and was wearing a sporty shirt and shorts, along with cute white sandals to look very casual. She soon met Han, who greeted her, and they sat down at a table to talk. She asked what he was doing there at that hour, and then he pulled out a gift box to give to her. He explained it was for her family, and Ju-gyung replied that he didn't need to go to the trouble, blushing a little and thinking he couldn't do things like that to her. That's when Han said he had something to ask, and she jumped in surprise, feeling she wasn't ready for this kind of thing to happen so soon. Before he could say it, he asked if Ju-gyung's sister, he, was seeing anyone, leaving her frozen in shock, completely confused, as he nervously scratched his neck. He mentioned that her sister was the beautiful woman who came to the school some time ago, and Ju-gyung, feeling deflated, agreed that was the case. Later, she went home embarrassed. When he entered her room, she asked what all the fuss was about, and the protagonist looked at her, leaving her sister confused, and told her everything that had happened. She mentioned one of her teachers at school who was very handsome and liked her and wanted to go out with her, asking if he would like to go on a date to meet him someday. He found it strange and asked when he had seen her. Ju-gyung didn't know, but it had happened, and she thought she could go out with him, so the protagonist gave her his number. So, she arranged a date with the teacher for 3 in the afternoon. It had been a long time since he went on a blind date, and she was getting a bit nervous about it. The Korean history teacher seemed like a good option, so she went to the designated restaurant and approached the man, asking if he was Han, the person who had set up the date. He agreed and introduced himself as Han Junwoo, thanking her for accepting his invitation. She sat down and introduced herself as Lim Hee-hyung, feeling quite surprised. After all, although she wasn't sure about him being a teacher, he seemed intellectual and had a gentle voice. A waitress came over, ready to take their order. Han started by ordering pasta with creamy sauce, and he ordered garlic and oil spaghetti. After that, they sat in a long silence until the teacher decided to speak again. He mentioned that he must hear this often, but she was a stunning woman. She thanked him for the compliment and replied that he was also quite handsome. The dishes arrived, and he was pleased. After all, her partner was very gentlemanly, and it seemed like she was quite lucky with this date, and she commented that it was a nice place. However, he soon noticed he was the type of guy who chewed with his mouth open, and she couldn't bear the sight or that disgusting and irritating sound coming from him. So she politely asked if he could eat with his mouth closed. Han laughed and asked if she didn't know that food could taste better when enjoyed with an open mouth and that she should try it. But that only annoyed he, who didn't understand what this crazy guy was talking about. Not only that, but he slurped his noodles loudly, just as gross and attention-grabbing as before. She considered just running away from the restaurant without looking back, but then he removed his glasses, showing how handsome he was, making he hesitate. It felt like he was playing mind games with her. The teacher laughed, asking her not to pay him too much attention. Meanwhile, Ju-gyung hoped the date was going well. For now, it was time for her study session, and she started getting ready, realizing she also needed to buy a new cushion. Even though she was broke, because everything was so expensive, she still had to buy one anyway. When she finished, she went out shopping and was surprised by one of the products she saw, noticing how beautiful the packaging was. She really wanted it, but it was quite expensive, so she decides to check her phone to see all the options available, not understanding why that product had such a low rating of 2.5. In the user's opinions, despite the pretty packaging, it was a disappointment. A yellow shade with hints of pink and gray. It wasn't worth buying even though it was moisturizing. Other people complained that it was supposed to be moisturizing, but left their skin flaky, brightening at first, but then turning dark. The applicator was horrible, not worth it at all. Ju-gyung feels relieved to read other people's reviews, thinking she should just buy what she was already using. There was a good reason it was selling well. Later, when the study group ends, Kang says she wants to do something and asks what the guys think of the idea, as it's the weekend and they should do something. The protagonist says she has no plans, and Kang gets excited. Lee agrees too since he has no plans, and Taewon says his plans are probably just to study again. Kang tries to say they should do something other than studying. He wouldn't die just from missing one day of gaming. She suggests they go out for a mocha. The two don't understand what a mocha is, and Kang complains, asking what's wrong with them. Even Ju-hyung didn't know what it was until the day before. They should all at least try to keep up with things. And Ju-hyung whispers that mocha is correct. Kang gets excited again, asking if they should all go together. However, Lee stands up, saying no because he doesn't like singing. Kang sighs, saying she could still go with Ju-hyung and Taewoon, practically trying to drag the other one along. In the end, Lee ends up going with the three of them. On the way, the protagonist notices Lee is using a familiar keychain and asks where he bought it. He replies that he's always had one, leaving her surprised because she had the same one since elementary school when she went to Neverland. Lee mentions that he hasn't seen her using the old black backpack lately. Ju-hyung has difficulty explaining why, remembering that people always talked behind her back and even told her to look more feminine. Without those horror comics, spiders, and skulls, people would gossip less about her. But instead, Ju-hyung just replies to Lee that it wasn't for any special reason. And she asks if he's good at singing, curious if she might finally hear Lee sing. But he stays silent until they get to the karaoke, where Kang starts singing and has a good voice. She and Taewoon sing together until Kang runs out of breath, asking her friend to sing one too since last time she didn't sing anything, and the protagonist remembers she's not good. On top of that, she doesn't know any of the songs to sing until she finally finds one she knows and remembers that people always complain because it's the same one. Always singing the same song and having no musical taste, it was one she listened to until her ears blurred. Even though she's nervous, Ju-hyung decides to pick the song to sing. Kang is shocked because she chose such an old song and doesn't understand how she knows it. Even off-key and clumsy, Ju-hyung starts singing, a bit scared. Seeing this, Lee starts laughing, which makes Kang watch until Ju-hyung finishes and just cancels the song when she realizes she's embarrassing herself. Suddenly, they hear a voice. It's that other person singing in the booth they heard last time, and Ju-hyung considers it must be Seojun, and Kang suggests Lee should sing too. Mentally, the protagonist can only think that she can't let those two meet again, considering the argument they had last time. That's when Ju-hyung starts feeling a stomachache, curling up and muttering that the soda had too much gas. She needed to go to the bathroom now, or she'd explode. So, she whispers to Kang to cover for her, maybe sing 3 songs, and although confused, Kang agrees. Then Ju-hyung leaves the room to check if anyone is outside. Luckily, no one is there, and Ju-hyung decides she should buy as much time as she can. That's when she runs into Seojun, who asks what she wants. Nervous, she remembers the earlier tension and doesn't know what to do because she doesn't want them to meet, trying to think of something to say to resolve the situation. Ju-hyung decides to say something random, unsure of what she's doing deep down, stammering to talk to him until finally 2 men come out of the karaoke booth. They asked Seojun why he wasn't answering his phone, even though he had said he wanted to go to a cyber cafe, and then they noticed Ju-hyung staring at her intently. She was surprised because she realized those 2 were the idiots at the diner she had accidentally bumped into some time ago, and it had been Seojun himself who had helped. The guys asked who the pretty girl was, remarking that Seojun always seemed lucky with all the girls, and introduced themselves as his friends, leaving Ju-hyung a bit shocked. Since the other day, they had treated her like complete trash, and this only irritated Seojun even more. He told them all to leave, making them complain that he was being selfish. Sighing, he said he was tired of this nonsense and told her to just say what she needed. And Ju-hyung completely regretted coming to talk to him. She needed to leave anyway. She had been too hasty, and she just left, shaken by everything, not noticing that someone was watching her from behind a wall. A little later, she went out with Kang to chat. She mentioned that the beautiful voice they'd heard earlier belonged to Seojun, feeling she should have spoken to Kang before she left and now felt tangled up in things she shouldn't have. Besides, Kang sang many songs to buy time for Ju-hyung and apologized for it, but Ju-hyung didn't mind and was more worried they had misunderstood the situation. Kang reassured her that the important thing was that Seojun and Lee didn't run into each other that day. They could forget everything and have some ice cream to cheer up. The next day, Lee found Ju-hyung listening to music and asked what she was doing there, catching her by surprise before she asked if he had eaten anything yet. He sat beside her nodding, while Ju-hyung said she was listening to music and enjoyed the lunch she had with him, suggesting they could do it again sometime. Then he asked how her stomach was after what happened at karaoke, and she laughed nervously, replying that it had bothered her a little, but she was much better. Lee asked what she was listening to, and she offered him one of her earbuds to listen, asking what he thought of the music because it was good. He agreed that it was. Ju-gi-young laughed because she never imagined he liked rock music, though he said he wasn't that big of a fan, then showed her his playlist, catching her totally off guard. It was full of sweet songs, and Ju-gi-young laughed, saying she still liked good rock songs and hoped he didn't only listen to that in his free time. Then she leaned in to show him the app she was using, making Lee blush, revealing that the app also analyzed the songs he listened to and made recommendations. She showed him that he could press the heart icon, and when tapping on Mix, he could create playlists. She suggested downloading it on his phone, and Lee agreed, letting her do it. Then she showed that with this app, he could have much more variety in music, and he thanked her, commenting on when they were in the karaoke the other day. Ju-gi-young tensed up, remembering what happened and waiting to hear what he had to say, but Lee changed his mind and let it go, and they parted to return to their classrooms. A little later, she returned with an ice cream as a thank you gesture for Kang, who explained she had news because an entertainment agency had just announced a new program. It was a new competition for singers, and all the contestants were impressive names. Ju-gi-young was surprised and looked at all the names on the list, realizing they were indeed. They were exotic, attractive people, and she pointed out a guy named Aiden, who was good-looking. His parents were from different backgrounds, but he spoke Korean perfectly. Also, he was their age, and after hearing so much about Aiden from Kang, Ju-gi-young could only laugh nervously and agree that he was indeed a very handsome guy. But Kang kept talking about how much potential he had and was sure all the chosen ones would have their own flair. Meanwhile, he overheard that they needed makeup assistants. It was too late because they had the whole schedule organized, but the woman pleaded with he, saying she should know how things were. They couldn't start the photo shoot with just the people they had available. He asked if they couldn't hire people from outside as a possible alternative. The woman agreed, but hadn't found anyone who met the requirements. Besides, it was just for a makeup assistant, and it would be overkill to call in a whole team now. After thinking it over, he felt there were very few days left until the shoot, wondering where she could find someone, until she remembered her sister Ju-gi-young and smiled. She stated that she knew where she could find an assistant, so a little later, the protagonist found herself in the studio, surprised because it was even bigger than she had imagined. The night before, her sister had called her for the job. It was just a simple assistant job. She could think about it a bit and would only need to take care of things on set. It would be completely different from watching on TV, and the woman who met Ju-gi-young at the studio was surprised because she looked a lot like her sister Hee, even more than before. Even though she was nervous, the protagonist greets her, even as the woman bombards her with questions and offers, commenting that it was pretty hot outside and she could grab something to drink. When the protagonist declines, the woman continues, saying they should talk for a minute before starting. She was sure Ju-gi-young knew what kind of show this was. After all, it was *Pick Boys*. This was the makeup concept for that day's shoot, and she shows her some examples, promising that it wasn't anything complicated. She could just relax. All she had to do was help her with the makeup, and Ju-gi-young agrees, excited because there were a lot of people working there with makeup and styling. It was really cool and a nice environment. The makeup artist asks for the protagonist's help, impressing her with the sheer amount of makeup, which must have cost a fortune. The guy being made up looked quite puffy and upset, and the makeup artist asks why. He says he tried hard not to eat the night before, but ended up losing his willpower. The makeup artist assures him it's fine, they could do something about his puffy face. She starts with a foundation and asks him to close his eyes. Ju-gi-young is impressed with her skills. She didn't even hesitate while working on his skin. She was truly a skilled makeup artist. This must be the real touch of an expert. She had never used anything like a stick before. She didn't even know that male idols wore as much makeup as female idols did. That's when a man exclaims, announcing they will be taking photos one by one. They would start with whoever wanted to go first, and the makeup artist asks if Ju-gi-young could finish with his lips, applying the color she was using. She agrees, though nervous. She still couldn't quite breathe right in that studio, but she helps apply the color to the guy's lips, hoping it's good enough, and he thanks them before stepping away. She's surprised because that was what working backstage felt like. Then Aiden suddenly appears, showing off that he used several face masks before arriving. He shows the makeup artist how good his skin looked that day. It was glowing and smooth, and she just ignores him after finishing with another guy. Aiden complains that he's starving because he hadn't eaten anything since the night before, and he notices he doesn't know Ju-gyong, surprising her because this was the mixed-race idol Kang had been talking about earlier. Aiden compliments her, saying she's very pretty, enough to be a trainee at their company and totally his type, and introduces himself to her. The makeup artist suggests doing his makeup. He was naturally handsome, even without any makeup. He just needed a few touch-ups from time to time, and she hands him the foundation for Ju-gyong to work on Aiden. Though nervous, Aiden is thrilled because he'd love to have her work on him, asking her to make him look amazing. She worries she might mess it up since she's not that skilled. Aiden asks her just to make him as gorgeous as her own makeup, and he wants to know about her beautiful contact lenses, needing to know everything Ju-gyong uses. He also asks her age because she seems pretty young, and she nervously says she's still a high school student, then asks him to stay still, which doesn't happen. Since Aiden is all excited and thrilled that they're the same age, he wants to be friends with her. They could skip the work formalities and asks where she lives. Wanting to know which school she goes to, he tells her he attends an art school. Ju-gyong replies that she goes to another school not too far from there. This only makes Aiden happier because he has a friend who goes to her school, and he asks for her number so the three of them could go out to eat sometime. The protagonist agrees as long as they can finish his makeup first, and Ju-gyong gives him her number, feeling that he's a guy with way too much energy. He smiles and thanks her for getting close to him, saying they're friends now. Finally, Ju-gyong finishes the makeup, making Aiden super happy because he looks even more stunning. He wants to post it on social media right away, so the makeup artist says Aiden can go till his makeup is done. Aiden thanks Ju-gyong and leaves. She sighed in exhaustion, feeling like her soul had left her body. But one thing was certain, it had been a very fulfilling day. Ju-gyong returned home after work. He apologized to her sister for being too busy that day and not being able to check on her, but she must have done something right because the makeup director was pleased. So much so that he seemed proud of Ju-gyong, and he asked if things went well. She agreed that everything went fine and loved being there, saying maybe she should learn even more about makeup. Her sister was happy that she liked it so much, mentioning that she'd heard there would be a makeup showcase at Innisfree in their neighborhood the next day, and she should check it out. That famous girl would be there too, a blogger that Ju-gyong always watched, and the protagonist got excited because the great Selena would be present at the event. When she arrived at the venue, she found several women murmuring and talking about Serena Lee, the makeup goddess. Ju-gyong was excited and super nervous, hardly believing it. The great Selena would be coming to her neighborhood, following the latest trend in skin analysis that everyone was talking about. Ju-gyong noticed it was a makeup style she'd seen many times before. She went to a makeup store where the staff offered to help with a skin test for her, saying she'd be surprised when she discovered the current condition of her skin. They insisted because her skin seemed dehydrated and too dry, and Ju-gyong explained that her face always felt dry after washing, to which the staff member smiled. The staff member said she needed a hydration treatment and that she also had hidden spots. It would be good to use a bit of brightening as well. Ju-gyong was shocked by the information. They were spots that would likely become visible later, and the staff member advised that prevention was the best cure, suggesting products with vitamin C and sunscreen to help with hydration. Besides the brightening, which only made her want to spend even more than before, Ju-gyong really wanted to buy products to help with her problematic skin. After buying some, the woman continued explaining how the app saved her old data so she could easily compare it later and could return the following month to check the results. Suddenly, everyone noticed that Selena had arrived, and Ju-gyong quickly turned, searching for her, shocked to see it was really her, introducing herself. As a professional makeup artist, Selena thanked everyone for coming that day. The makeup she would show was how to achieve a natural look, the same style she had recently done. Recently, she had worked with TV commercial legend Jae Jung, and she showed that the key was to add a bit of essence to the foundation when applying, reminding everyone to mix gently. Using a spatula, she applied just a little, showing how the skin looked more radiant now, a great technique for summer, which amazed the protagonist, who was recording. It seemed like a professional touch really made all the difference, very different from the heavy makeup Ju-gyong usually did. Selena demonstrated the entire process. The protagonist wondered if she could one day become like her. After finishing her demonstration, Selena thanked everyone for being there because they would soon have a complete session. Ju-kyung nearly fainted with happiness when Selena looked and smiled at her. After that, she started researching colleges with makeup departments at home that evening. She wanted to become a professional makeup artist in the future, like Selena, and the next day, she told Kang, who complained that she hadn't been invited, saying she wanted to be in her place, enviously. So Ju-kyung invited her to come to a college with her if she was free the next day, saying she wanted to learn makeup but didn't have any proper knowledge. It wasn't like she hadn't done anything right, so she was thinking of going there for advice, but was afraid of going to the college alone and seeing everything. Kang laughed, saying it seemed like Ju-kyung couldn't do anything without her, and agreed to go with her, joking that it would be nice if she could get Aiden's autograph in return afterward. A little later, Ju-kyung received a message from Lee to meet him at 10 o'clock in the reading room, so she went to see him, apologizing for being late. He looked at her and asked if she was sick again. Ju-kyung asked if she looked like it, and he agreed, even though she insisted she was perfectly fine and there was nothing wrong. Then she told him she was thinking of learning professional makeup. Lee asked if she wasn't already using enough, and Ju-kyung explained that it wasn't for herself. Anyway, she was going to study hard from that day on to become really good at it. Although they had gathered to study after class, Ju-kyung ended up falling asleep at the table. He approaches to offer her a drink and just watches her dozing off. When the protagonist realizes, she wakes up in shock because she had fallen asleep in the library. But next to her, Lee was also dozing off, and she's unsure how long they had been like that, or why she was sleeping right next to him like this. Still, Ju-kyung quietly observes him, thinking that he was really close, noticing that Lee had long eyelashes. Suddenly, he opens his eyes, catching her blushing as she looked at him. Her heart races, and Ju-kyung feels confused, wondering what this feeling was. She jumps up, her heart pounding hard. Not understanding how her heart could be beating so fast, she wonders if it's because she stayed up all night the day before, feeling like she might have overdone it and should just go home now. So, Ju-kyung mentions she'll call it a day, and he stands up as well to accompany her, and she just walks ahead of him through the night, wondering what was wrong. For some reason, Ju-kyung couldn't look into his eyes, and at a certain point, she mentions that she's almost home, and he should go home too since it's late. Lee says he'll only do that once she's inside, and she nervously agrees and says goodbye, hurrying away, still embarrassed. But she pauses after walking a bit. Looking back, she can still see Lee watching her, so she finally enters her house, still thinking about the whole situation. Maybe she's seeing him too often, to realize that Lee was actually quite handsome. He didn't talk much, but he was also very kind. But she tries to stop her thoughts, not understanding how she ended up thinking about him this way. Seeing him without makeup was absurd, but even so, Ju-kyung can't fall asleep, wondering what she should do. She had to visit that beauty school the next day, and Kang asks the protagonist how the consultation went after her visit. Ju-kyung replies that it wasn't bad at all, but the problem was that the tuition was much higher than she expected. Kang suggests that she should tell her mother first, and she replies that she's not sure if her mom would allow it. It was a lot of money to invest. Her friend insists that at least she could try. Besides, she went there because she really wanted to, and the protagonist thanks her for coming along. When she gets home, Ju-kyung nervously follows her mother around until her mother gets annoyed, asking what's wrong with her and that if she wants to talk, she should just say it. The protagonist murmurs nervously, remembering that the beginner course with the first tuition payment was 2 million won, and she hesitates completely to tell the truth. Ju-kyung stammers that it's nothing and instead asks what they'll have for dinner that night. Her mother replies that it's dried pollock soup and asks her to set the table for now. Still, she feels she'll have to tell her sooner or later. The next day, Kang notices that Ju-kyung still hasn't managed to tell her mother the truth about college. While they're walking, they notice a girl hunched over at a table, whining about something. The girls around her comment that Lee had rejected her cruelly. They say they don't even like someone like him, always with that silent monk aura that makes them dislike him. It wasn't the right time, so she shouldn't be crying over that jerk. The protagonist feels curious, watching the girls talking, and one asks what he said. Another replies that she doesn't know. He just called her and apologized, probably because he likes someone else. They say he must think he's all that just because he's handsome and can get anything he wants, but she shouldn't cry so much since there are other guys out there. Her friends try to comfort the rejected girl. Kang whispers to Ju-kyung but that's the girl who was going to the same class as Lee. It seems she got rejected. With a face like his, he could win over anyone, but he still had high standards. It looks like he's interested in someone now. Ju-young is a bit shocked to hear all this. She had no idea Lee had someone in mind. When she meets him, he seems annoyed because she hadn't read his message. He wants to know if she's going to the library or not, and she apologizes, saying her phone ran out of battery. She thinks it wouldn't be strange if he didn't like someone, considering he's always been popular. There have always been all kinds of girls wanting to go out with Lee. Suddenly, as they're walking, Aiden appears, asking Ju-young about the messages. She also hadn't read his messages, even though he'd sent several about how things were going throughout the night, and he'd waited for her all that time, then ran to hug the protagonist. She ducked to dodge the hug, apologizing because her battery had died, a bit surprised by Aiden's sudden presence. He asked if Lee was Ju-young's boyfriend. She nervously denied it, explaining that he was her friend Lee, and Lee introduced himself to Aiden, saying they met when he helped at the company where his older sister also worked. Aiden was quite charmed because Lee was very handsome and tall, like a real model, and asked if they were going out to eat, clearly interested in what they were going to do. The protagonist stammered, asking Lee if he was hungry, and they continued walking, even with Aiden following them, saying they should go now because it was going to be great. He knew a super delicious place that would blow their minds, but Ju-young wasn't impressed with the place when they arrived, even though Aiden was very excited. He helped pull her chair to make her comfortable, saying they shouldn't be surprised yet because they hadn't seen anything. Aiden sat beside the protagonist, laughing the entire time. He commented that it was the best place ever. He could swear it was his favorite restaurant in the whole world. He and his other trainees ate there all the time. It was fantastic. He also forgot to mention that he invited the friend he told Ju-young about the other day to join them for a meal, hoping they wouldn't mind. The protagonist said it was fine, the more, the merrier, and suggested they order something to eat first while waiting for the fourth person. The food arrived, and Aiden tried to help Ju-young with the dishes, and she thanked him, though feeling tense, as he insisted she try the cheese katsu that melted in her mouth and tasted amazing. He put it on a fork and offered to feed it to her, asking her to trust him. Ju-young was somewhat shocked, seeing this scene right before her eyes, but she opened her mouth. Letting Aiden feed her, he was thrilled, asking if she liked it. She chewed the food as he noticed some sauce on her face. He helped wipe her face, making the protagonist think that Aiden was really a nice guy, but he was a bit over the top with his sincerity and kindness, almost trying to be too familiar. He laughed, asking if she wanted another bite, and the protagonist stammered, saying she was fine for now. That's when Lee finally intervened, telling Aiden to stop it immediately. It was clear that the protagonist was uncomfortable, and Aiden apologized, saying he hadn't realized. Ju-young replied that it was okay, though still nervous, silently begging for help. Suddenly, they heard a sound, and Aiden realized it was his friend who must have just arrived, but they hadn't expected that the person who walked in would be his friend. It was Sujin himself, almost making Ju-young scream in surprise as Lee and Sujin exchanged tense glares. Shortly after, Sujin quickly left the restaurant. Aiden tried to ask him to stay, not understanding why he was in such a rush, but Sujin said never to invite him out again if that jerk was at the table, leaving Aiden confused. Sujin asked how they two knew each other, and Aiden explained that he had come to meet Ju-young, and they ended up eating together. She also helped him at the photo shoot the other day with the makeup. Sujin asked if he was serious about that dumb Pick Boys audition, and he agreed. Still confused about why Sujin was so angry, wondering if something was wrong, he mentioned that if all went well, he could debut, which made Sujin recall memories from his past. Hearing the same words from someone else, he decided to leave the discussion for later, saying goodbye and leaving Aiden behind. Meanwhile, Ju-young felt tense and quiet, wondering what she should do and not knowing what to say in this situation. That's when Lee got up, excusing himself. He said he needed to leave, and she agreed, saying she could let Aiden know he had left. A little later, Aiden returned, and Ju-young explained that Lee had also left earlier. He felt sad, not understanding what was going on, and the protagonist admitted she was equally confused, but she changed the subject when Aiden mentioned he had received his photos from before. Aiden showed them to Ju-young, who was impressed because the photos were great. It was different to see him like that and in person. He said it was all thanks to her efforts. The protagonist was surprised to see how her makeup looked in the photos, and the comments were positive too. She was happy that people liked it. At home, Ju-kyung takes a refreshing shower and decides to talk to her mom. She gets distracted when her mom offers her some peaches that look delicious and starts chatting with her about the fruit. She cuts the bigger pieces for the other kids, leaving Ju-kyung with the leftovers, which hurts her a bit because her mom knew she loved peaches and acted like this. That's when Ju-kyung gathers the courage to ask if her mom could sign her up for a school, and her mom turns, surprised, asking what kind of school she means. She admits it's a beauty school for makeup classes, but her mom dismisses the idea, saying that with all the makeup she wears every day, she should be the one teaching it. Ju-kyung retorts that her mom hadn't even let her finish, explaining that she'd get a makeup artist license and go to college. She really wanted to learn something professional. Her mom sighs, still refusing, saying they couldn't afford it. Even though she thought Ju-kyung had finally decided to study, she was still being ridiculous, comparing her to her siblings. Frustrated, the protagonist storms to her room, slamming the door, furious, because her mom never even listened to her, never genuinely caring or hearing her out. The next morning, the protagonist wakes up after crying all night, still feeling hungry. Young tells their mom that his course will end late and he'll be out until after midnight. Ju-kyung doesn't understand because she thought her brother wasn't attending any courses, and he explains he's starting one that day, shocking her because he's taking acting classes. He's learning proper acting, feeling quite proud of himself. Ju-kyung questions her mom about why her brother can do it, but she can't. It felt incredibly unfair. Her mom responds that it's because they're different. Her younger brother is determined to do something with his life, while she just sits around complaining, which only hurts Ju-kyung more. It felt like her mom truly disliked her. Her older sister received endless praise as the first child, and her spoiled younger brother was the only boy. She felt completely disregarded. A bit later, Ju-kyung tells Kang everything, imagining she must have been adopted to be treated so poorly. Kang asks her not to say such things because it's normal. Her family also gives special treatment to the oldest, but Ju-kyung is still upset, considering getting a part-time job to pay for the tuition herself. Kang is shocked because it would overwhelm her with school, but the protagonist doesn't want to give up before trying. She's thinking of working at a convenience store. It's almost June, and there's only one national exam left. If she fails, she'd have to wait another whole year. And Kang agrees that Ju-kyung doesn't have much time to waste. She's starving because she didn't have breakfast, so they decide to head to the cafeteria, hearing a singer's voice and noticing people from the music club practicing together. It's probably for the school festival. Kang says they should go to the festival too because it would be fun, and they head to the cafeteria, where Ju-kyung spots Sujin in the distance. She seems different, and the protagonist steers Kang away, saying she left some bread in her backpack, leaving Kang confused because they had walked all the way there for nothing. Ju-kyung wonders what happened to Sujin. She looked quite different, and her social media had been switched to private. Something must have happened. Maybe she was sick. Sujin receives a message from her mom saying she visited the real estate office and they'll need to find another place to live, only making her more frustrated. Life was always a struggle. Every day something bad happened. Later, the protagonist goes to a store to apply for the part-time job, ready to commit to working there for at least 6 months. The owner says she should start the next day, arriving 10 minutes early to change. He thinks Ju-kyung is pretty and could help boost sales a bit. The protagonist feels excited to get the job, and the next day she arrives on time, introducing herself to the other employee who was also starting that day, caught by surprise. Because the woman looks almost like her without makeup, the employee tells her that the manager asked her to show her around, and Ju-kyung follows her, still a bit shocked because the woman was really identical to her. Days pass, and Ju-kyung tells Kang about her co-worker who looked like her. She must be a beautiful woman underneath too. But little did Kang know that it was completely different. She looked like her without makeup. However, even more surprising than that was seeing that the same girl was actually at her school, catching the attention of some students with some papers in hand, and she'd probably recognized Ju-kyung as well. The protagonist returns to work as usual and can't help but think that the more they looked each other in the eye, the more they truly resembled one another. She knew it was her first job, but 2 weeks had passed, and it remained as challenging as it was in the beginning. She attended the convenience store next to hers. People placed their orders, and sometimes she was sent to fetch things for her to do, and Ju-kyung had to take a deep breath and stay calm to avoid saying anything. She handed over the product the man requested and stated the price of 1400 won. He also asked for a cigarette, which again irritated the protagonist due to his tone. Still, Ju Gi-young took what he asked for and repeated the price, and soon the man grew annoyed with her for not addressing him as sir, and she stammered that he was rude to her. However, this only worsened the situation as the man shouted that it was unacceptable and demanded to speak to the manager immediately, saying she couldn't treat customers this way. Ju Gi-young shrank, thinking she shouldn't have said anything, until her co-worker appeared and approached, telling the man that if he continued to cause such a commotion in the store, she would call the police. He should know they had security cameras there, which left the man confused and moving toward her in an intimidating and aggressive manner. She took out her phone, telling him to leave before she called the police, causing other customers to murmur among themselves before he angrily shouted that he would never return to this place. Finally, Ju Gi-young sighed in relief as her co-worker said she had come back to pick up her keys. He was indeed a crazy old man, and she would likely encounter many like him while working there. The protagonist thanked her and thought she was amazing. If it hadn't been for her co-worker, the situation would have turned out terribly. That girl might look like her, but she had a completely different personality, and it was quite a way to start her first job. She hoped this wouldn't happen again after such a tense moment. However, instead of leaving, Ju Gi-young was surprised to see that she was still at the back, and before she could go, the protagonist asked her to wait and offered a small gift. It wasn't much, but she wanted to thank her for the earlier help with a drink. Her co-worker responded that it was okay and accepted her thanks, suggesting they could become friends and grow closer. After all, she had heard that Ju Gi-young was only a year older than her. The girl's name was Go-woon Han, and Ju Gi-young asked why she was still waiting in the store instead of leaving. Maybe she was waiting for someone. Han said she had been practicing something that wasn't going well, and the protagonist grew curious, wondering if it was about a musical. Her co-worker was surprised that Ju Gi-young knew about it and mentioned that they went to the same school. She had seen her singing while passing by the music club. Han was still shocked because the chances of them working together and also going to the same school were very low, and Ju Gi-young responded that she had always wanted to talk to her. After all, Han had a great voice and could dance too. She thanked her despite envying Ju Gi-young, which left her puzzled, and her co-worker explained it was because she was beautiful. Ju Gi-young replied that she was pretty too, with amazing skin and a nose she would love to have. Han couldn't believe it, thinking it sounded like she was bluffing, but thanked her anyway. Before she could say goodbye, she checked if the protagonist had her phone number, and after exchanging contacts, Ju Gi-young was happy to have her lookalike's number now. Her name was really quite beautiful. However, the next day, Han seemed tense and distant, making the protagonist wonder if something happened, and she asked if she was busy. Han replied that she wasn't, so Ju Gi-young suggested they could do something together, and her co-worker agreed, saying she would return after rehearsal, and the two met again afterward. Han was surprised. They were going to eat what seemed like yakisoba, and Ju Gi-young asked her to try it because she bought it from a food truck near her apartment, and it was delicious. The girl tried the yakisoba and found it really good, feeling in a better mood now. Finally, the protagonist asked if there was anything wrong with Han. She looked away, saying it was nothing major, unsure if she should even tell Ju Gi-young. She wouldn't understand, and it was a bit embarrassing to say out loud. This was because earlier at school, it was announced that the main roles in the musical would go to Han and a boy named Subin. Han had always had small, insignificant roles. She was quite proud to have landed the role of the main character. At first, she thought her efforts had finally been rewarded, so she left very pleased with the results. She was about to change into her clothes for gym class when she suddenly heard voices discussing the casting decisions. To them, it seemed like a big bad joke. Casting Han as the protagonist was ridiculous, they thought, but they could understand Subin's case since he was attractive. They were supposed to be on stage in front of the entire audience, but now that wouldn't be the case. Out of all possible people, it had to be Han. She never wore makeup, but even so, it wouldn't make a difference. Her presence on stage was an insult to the audience as a whole. They even felt sorry for Subin for being stuck with her, thinking that the musical wasn't about Princess Fiona, so it didn't need someone unattractive. Their teacher had failed in the casting choices this time. They said roles should be given based on talent, and they hated how she was so confident for no reason. They bet the actress would cry when she found out that her name and Han's were the same. After hearing this, Han states that it took more than just talent. No matter how hard she tried or how good she was, she would end up being humiliated for it. Her unattractive appearance scared people, but Jukyung exclaimed that they were all wrong and shouldn't let that get her down. Han, with a self-conscious laugh, replied that it wasn't that simple. It wasn't just them. Everyone thought the same. Still, she wanted to look beautiful on stage this time. She didn't know why. Maybe because it was her first lead role. But Han really wanted to look appropriate, even though she didn't know how to do it. She apologized because she didn't want to make Joo Hyung feel down or uncomfortable with these problems. The next day, the protagonist wonders why people judge others based on their appearance. She even finds a self-esteem campaign telling people to love themselves. But that didn't help at all. People always made cruel comments. And right now, they were gossiping about how Soojin had put on weight recently. It was unbelievable. They laughed because his legs were so thick that they thought he looked like an elephant, and his double chin was incredible. Joo Hyung thinks they'll never be free from lookism. She wonders if people would find her fake because she wore makeup, even though she could live a normal life like everyone else, thanks to that same makeup. In school, it was easy to be ignored or become an outcast if you were unattractive. If that were the case, whose fault was it, the victims or the bullies? As she reflected quietly on this, Lee suddenly appeared, asking why Joo Hyung was standing there looking so puzzled, surprising her with his sudden presence. Lee said they should be asking why she hadn't been showing up to study sessions lately, and Joo Hyung stammered that some things had happened. He showed all the notes he had made, and she was surprised. Lee said she would need good grades for the finals if she wanted to get into a good college, so she should study. He asked her to attend the study session that weekend. Joo Hyung smiled and thanked him, making him turn around blushing, promising he'd be there again. A little later, Han was surprised because Joo Hyung came to see her and asked if it would be okay to do her makeup for the musical performance. This took Han by surprise. After all, she didn't even have double eyelids. She thought makeup wouldn't make much difference. Even when she traced a thick line on her eyes, she couldn't see it. Joo Hyung explained that there were many makeup styles these days that worked without double eyelids and were beautiful and unique. Han could only nod and thank her. At home, she thought she couldn't mess this up, so she researched makeup extensively, thinking about how many attractive styles there were for single eyelids. She continued researching all types of makeup possible. The next day, she told Kang everything, wondering if she could really do it, and her friend encouraged her that she could. After all, Joo Hyung did a great job working with Aiden last time. There was only one day left until the festival. Being a senior ruined all the fun. The next day arrived, and Kang was excited. She brought her professional camera to take beautiful pictures of the freshmen, and the protagonist told her to be careful to hide it before the teacher arrived. The teacher soon appeared, saying they could study alone after the morning meeting. A little later, the protagonist received a message from Han saying she was free. The performance began and continued with some students. Then, Joo Hyung asked Kang to take her place while she took care of Han's makeup, and Han soon nodded for her to do so. The protagonist approaches and realizes that the world looked entirely different from backstage. Han agrees and notices that Joo Hyung had various makeup products accumulated in her bag. Removing her glasses, Joo Hyung explains that what she was about to do wasn't just about making her look pretty. It was about bringing out her hidden beauty, and she asks her to close her eyes. Han does as she's told, and Joo Hyung thinks of applying a few face masks first, then shows her the result in the mirror, leaving Han shocked at her appearance. The protagonist laughs at how much she's changed in such a short time and thanks her friend for it. Joo Hyung responds that everything would be fine and she could go to her performance because everyone was waiting. Then Joo Hyung goes back to where Kang was and waits to see her friend's musical, where Han appears and Kang asks if that was the friend she mentioned earlier. The protagonist agrees, and all the students around are surprised because she looked very beautiful and they had never seen her like this before. Joo Hyung almost gets emotional. She wonders what those mean kids who mocked Han before would think now, trying to stay positive because she hoped for a good reaction from the crowd. With that, the festival at Ila concluded, and they thanked everyone for coming that day. Kang said she'd be busy with some extra photos from the dance club at the end of the event. Then, Han approaches to thank Joo Hyung, saying she couldn't have done any of it without her and wished she were her real sister at this point, after all the help she'd given. Joo Hyung claps, praising her for rocking it on stage, when suddenly Han looks over at Seojin, and the protagonist freezes, realizing he's approaching with flowers. She wonders what he's doing there, noticing that the two actually looked quite similar, and Ju-Young turns away, pretending she isn't there while they talk. Seojun is surprised because he almost didn't recognize Han and asks who did this for her. It took him forever to find her, and she laughs, taking it as a compliment. She asks if the flowers are for her, and he hands her the bouquet, complimenting her efforts that day. Han introduces Ju-Young as the friend who did her makeup that day. Ju-Young gets tense and nervous greeting Seojun, who recognizes her immediately, while the protagonist jokes that he should actually be Han's brother. He should consider himself lucky to have such a beautiful sister, but she says goodbye after praising Han's efforts that day, mentioning her friend was waiting for her, so she needed to go now. After saying goodbye, Han mentions she should buy something for her, and Seojun, still glancing at Ju-Young, agrees with his sister and accompanies her. At night, the protagonist sighs, realizing that finding out they were siblings was a huge surprise. It was no wonder Han increasingly looked like someone familiar when she did her makeup. She wonders how she always kept running into him. Maybe it was just bad luck. She had become friends with her and didn't want things to get awkward anytime soon. Suddenly, Ju-Young receives notifications and wonders who it could be on her phone, and simultaneously, Seojun receives messages with a link about his sister Han on the internet. He opens a social media post where they're talking about Han the eyelid goddess, and thousands of people liked the posts. Seojun gets frustrated as people comment about it. Additionally, they mention that Ju-Young did the makeup, turning her into a real celebrity, and that's how he stumbled upon the protagonist's social media. After getting out of the shower, Han asks if her brother knows where the conditioner is, and he hides his phone when she questions why he's watching and if it's something inappropriate. He stammers, saying he's just checking things, then asks if she knows she's now a celebrity, and Han is shocked because she doesn't even have real social media and wants to know what it is. She asks him to show her when he gets back. After Han leaves, Seojun sighs, still looking at Ju-Young's social media, and freezes when he realizes he accidentally added her without meaning to, and Ju-Young, distracted on her phone, notices people loving Han now, feeling proud of her friend's rise, until she realizes someone added her. She's confused to see that it was Seojun, while he cringes at home, embarrassed for acting impulsively without thinking, considering canceling the friend request. But without knowing why he doesn't cancel, and before he can retract it, a notification shows that Ju-Young accepted his request, nearly making him shout in shock. Meanwhile, at the convenience store, Han thanks the protagonist, saying she had a great experience, and she responds that it's all good because Han deserved everything she went through and achieved. She asks if Han has any other plans after work, and Ju-Young denies it, wondering why she's asking. Han replies that she would like to learn how to do makeup. This takes Ju-Young by surprise as her friend explains that after that day, she gained confidence in wearing makeup, but couldn't always ask for Ju-Young's help. Every time she wanted to take care of herself, or when there was a musical to prepare for, she wanted to learn to do it on her own, and the protagonist agrees. Promising she'd teach her after work, Han is happy and asks if she could visit her house to learn. It was a bit awkward to do it outside, and her mom would be home late, so they didn't need to worry. Ju-Young is a bit shocked because this would mean she'd have to go to Seojun's place in the end. Still, she agrees, even if a bit nervous, and Han thanks her for her kindness. Later, Ju-Young arrives at her house, unable to believe she's actually entering Seojun's place. Han mentions that her house always feels different with Ju-Young around, and mentions that her brother would return home much later, which visibly relieves her. So, they decide to start the lessons. Ju-Young begins by explaining that they should first apply a bit of toning cream, a concealer she uses all the time. The ingredients don't clog the pores, she should just apply it to areas with skin issues. For the eyebrows, she can simply follow her natural contour. A unique thing about single eyelids is that eyeshadows work well with them, but it's not ideal for daily makeup, so she should only apply a light touch around her eyes, especially around the waterline. Then she can finish with a touch of hot pink lipstick, and everything would be perfect and appropriate. Han is impressed, as she looks much more lively. The girls in her class wore strange makeup, with white faces and bright red lips. Every day looked like Halloween, but Ju-Young's makeup was natural and beautiful, a totally different level, like something a true professional would always create. After thanking her, Ju-Young asks if Han also knows it's important to remove makeup. That part is her own responsibility, and she gives her the product, making Han even happier. until she realizes it's a product her brother uses every day, and Jugi-young is surprised because it's lip tint. Seo-jin used it back when he was a trainee. Although the protagonist tries to explain that men can also use makeup, Han still finds it gross since it wasn't just lip tint but also BB cream and eyeshadow. Personally, she didn't like men who wore makeup. Jugi-young wondered who did Seo-jin's makeup, but it was surprising he knew so much about it. To the point of doing the whole look himself and thinking more about it, he always had that cool, striking vibe that really suited him. Han says she's hungry and suggests they could eat some ramen, which the protagonist agrees to. Following the scent, Jugi-young ends up stopping at a spot where there were many photos on the fridge of two adorable kids. She could hardly believe Seo-jin was that cute as a baby, while she herself wasn't at all like that. All her photos with her siblings were of them fighting each other, but Han and Seo-jin seemed very close until she stopped to notice one photo in particular. There were three boys side by side, and she realized it was Seo-jin and Lee together, but there was a third unknown person when at that moment Seo-jin arrived. Surprised to see Jugi-young there, they both froze, one recalling the social media friend request and the other the chaos caused in the karaoke. Seo-jin starts considering saying it was all a mistake with the friend request, but it would be pathetic and make him look foolish. They had to stay calm and indifferent. The protagonist tries to greet him, and he questions the reason for her visit when Han shouts to her brother, realizing he's home and asking if he wants to eat something. Jugi-young takes a chance to explain that Han was the one who invited her, and Seo-jin just tells them to have fun, mentally relieved that he was managing to stay calm and composed. Although she could perfectly see his sweaty back, he goes to his room while the two girls talk about what he was like when he was little, making him a bit nervous. It was worrisome that Han might start talking about his silly childhood, and he didn't even know why he was getting so agitated just because they had a visitor, so time continued to pass. Until Jugi-young realized she should go home now. Han asked if she was really okay going alone because it was late. He replied that she was since she didn't live far. Suddenly, their mother appeared, curious to know who was at the house, and Jugi-young was stunned because their mother was actually very beautiful too. She introduced herself as Han's friend, and Han explained that she was the girl she had mentioned earlier who helped her with the festival makeup, with very talented and skillful hands. The mother rushed to thank Jugi-young, saying it was truly nice to meet her. She was so lovely, and it was very kind of her to help with her daughter's makeup. She felt a little sad that Jugi-young was leaving now. It would have been great if they could spend time together over dinner, and she invited her to visit any time she wanted. Jugi-young felt she smelled nice too. She was a young and friendly mother, but it was true it was getting quite late, and she asked if Seo-jin had just arrived now. The protagonist said it was fine and that she could go home now without any problems. It wasn't far enough to need to walk a lot, and she said goodbye to the family. Seo-jin left, agreeing with his mother that it was too late for the protagonist to go back alone, so they should go together, and Jugi-young couldn't help but agree with them. Thanking them for the invitations and kindness, the mother and Han agreed that she could visit whenever she liked and were curious to know if she was also friends with Seo-jin. Han didn't know because he didn't even go to school often. They didn't even seem close, but Jugi-young was very pretty, and they could have dinner together. Out on the street, the two walked down the road, with the protagonist feeling that strange atmosphere between them, unsure of what to do. That absolute silence was unbearable. That's when she tried to start a conversation, commenting on how his sister mentioned he was so good at makeup, seriously thinking he was talented. He looked away, replying that she was just saying that, and Jugi-young insisted, thinking it was amazing that he could recognize his own unique and worthy style. Besides, he had chosen the perfect color for the lips too, although she wondered if she was overdoing it. Seo-jin mentioned that she was good at it herself. After all, she managed to make Han look decent, which should count for something, and Jugi-young replied that it was only because his sister was very beautiful by herself too. Even so, her brother was glad that she seemed happy that day thanks to Jugi-young, and the protagonist noticed he could have a sweet side when it came to his sister. He even brought flowers for Han that other day, showing he wasn't such a bad guy. Finally, they arrived at her apartment, and he noticed it wasn't that far after all. He said goodbye to the protagonist, and Jugi-young thanked him and turned to leave, feeling tired and wondering what the past relationship between Seo-jin and Lee was like to make them drift apart. She wondered if they used to be friends. No one could have guessed anything like this initially, but little did she know that Lee was secretly watching everything from behind one of the walls. At home, the protagonist received messages from Kang asking if she'd seen the Pick Pick Boys and the new episodes, as Aiden had received a ton of votes and his ranking had risen. She bet he might reach the finals. Ju Hyung was shocked as she had missed it. It looked like Aiden could indeed become a celebrity in the future. However, her eyes almost burned from embarrassment at the photos Aiden took. It was total secondhand embarrassment. Ju Hyung would rather go blind than see it, but there were comments. People commented that he would definitely debut, but it was strange because he should learn to speak Korean first. It seemed he wasn't putting in the effort, which was unfair to the others. They felt it was unfair that Aiden received all the votes just because he was cute when there were others more talented than him. They didn't want to lie that the others were more interesting. She was surprised because the comments were really harsh and hoped Aiden wasn't reading any of it. She'd sue everyone if she were in his place on the internet. They thought they could say these bad things just because they were anonymous. Suddenly, her mother appeared, questioning how Ju Hyung could do this, wanting to know if it was true that she was working every weekend at that convenience store, leaving her surprised, not understanding how they found out, and remaining silent at her mother's questions. This made the mother ask if she had given up on her studies. How did she plan to go to college? If she wanted to do things her way, she could leave the house after graduating if that was the case. Ju Hyung stammers, trying to explain herself to her furious mother, and he appears, asking her to calm down a bit and inquiring if Ju Hyung was really working at the store. She stammers that she is, which makes her mother say she heard about it from the neighbors, who obviously thought ridiculous things about her. How could a senior be working when she should be focused on studying? He tries to respond, saying her sister must have her reasons. Ju Hyun says she's trying to save money at work to pay for her beauty school tuition. She knew she had disappointed her mother because she didn't know what she wanted to do with her life and wasn't interested in studying further. To her mother, it might seem like just a silly way to put stuff on her face, but to Ju Hyun, it was the thing she loved most in the world, and she starts crying because of it. But Ju Hyun shouldn't worry because she didn't intend to ask her mother to pay for her tuition. She only wanted to do the things she loved and had chosen to do. She might not be the best daughter her mother had, but she promised to succeed someday and make her proud, so she asked her to at least believe in her efforts. While wiping her tears, Ju Hyun excuses herself, saying she needed to go out to get some fresh air. She leaves the house, remembering the argument. Ju Hyun knew she shouldn't compare other people's mothers, but she really wished she had someone like Han's mother in her life. She was sweet and understanding with her children. She was always there to listen to other people's problems, but no one ever heard her own. That's when Lee messaged her, asking if she was home. Ju Hyun replies that she went out for a bit, and he says he wanted to give her his notes for the final exams and asks when would be a good time for her. Ju Hyun sighs, feeling like a mess. She couldn't let others see her in such a chaotic state, but Lee was doing her a favor, so she agrees, saying now is fine. He could bring them since she was in the park near the comic store, and he replies he'll be there in a few minutes. Ju Hyun goes to the restroom to try to fix herself up a bit. It would have to do for now. She really didn't want Lee to see her without any makeup on. Soon after, they meet, and he notices the marks around her eyes. But she brushes it off, saying she hadn't been sleeping enough lately, which doesn't convince Lee, but he gives her the notes anyway, making Ju Hyun thank him for it. He asks if she's had anything for dinner, and when she says no, he suggests they go to the convenience store to grab something. Shortly after, he buys a few things for her. Ju Hyun wasn't familiar with what Lee bought, and he tells her it's one of the best dishes the convenience store has to offer when possible. When the protagonist tries it, she's surprised because it's delicious, especially since Lee seemed really good at choosing these things, and he smiles at her reaction. After a moment, he gets embarrassed by her response and says he'll be back shortly, leaving Ju Hyun puzzled about where he's going now. Soon after, Lee returns with the latest issues of a mystery comic because he knew she probably hadn't read them, and she's surprised because it's true, taking the chance to relax. For a moment, Ju Hyun was worried he'd taken her to the bookstore to study, but she decides to enjoy reading horror comics with him for the time being. After the reading session, Ju Hyun asks why he likes horror stories, and he replies it's probably just to relieve stress. He doesn't really know. For Ju Hyun, what she loved most was the art, especially monster movies, which she found amazing for the creativity behind them. They always sparked her imagination. Science fiction and horror were her favorite genres in particular. Lee asks if it didn't scare her, and she replies that people are the scariest. But it was too good to be outside. She didn't want to go back home now, and Ju Hyun talks about the fight with her mom. She had stopped studying and understood her mother's concerns. She wouldn't let her learn makeup, and it was all very complicated. Lee asks if she couldn't talk to her sister or friends about those things, or something like that. The protagonist laughs because it wasn't possible. She'd love to talk to her sister about it, but she was Miss Perfect, and she really couldn't share her problems with her like that. If she talked to her friends, they might think she was complaining. Everyone had their own problems, and Ju Hyung didn't want to just become another burden to them. She would manage to endure it on her own. However, Lee understood that it must be hard for her to keep everything to herself, making her blush as he told her to always tell the truth. She could always tell him whenever she felt bad. They could eat something and talk that way. Ju Hyung thanked him for this, a bit surprised by his suggestion. Then Lee stood up, suggesting they should go back now, since it was getting quite late, and he would take her home to make sure she'd be safe, which confused the protagonist. After all, she literally lived across the street, but thinking about it made Lee remember Seojin, and he insisted anyway. So Ju Hyung asked how his studies were going. It looked like he was preparing for finals, and he replied it was the same as always. Meanwhile, Seojin was alone in the bathroom, vomiting by herself. At school, Kang told the protagonist that Seojin had reactivated her social media. The boys were saying that she had let herself go lately, but it seemed like she lost all her extra weight. She had lost even more weight than before and was posting all these videos, bragging about her body as well. And it was true. Seojin was posting photos, looking better and better. Kang said it was healthy, but she couldn't lose weight if she ate 3 meals a day and exercised. It almost seemed like Seojin was born with that perfect body, and she'd hated her for wanting attention. But she'd like to ask what her diet secrets were and what she did to look like that. Ju Hyung replied that she was probably just born with a good body for it. Then, Ju Hyung suddenly received a message from Seojin, leaving her confused, but he asked what kind of thing an 18-year-old girl might like, sending her photos of a few options that left her without understanding what he meant. The first was an eco bag with a peculiar design, and the second was an adorable pink thermos bottle, but one that no one would even recommend for a child. Ju Hyung was surprised because this seemed to be the best he could come up with for a gift. She asked in the message if it was a gift, and he confirmed, saying it was his sister's birthday in 2 days, and he wanted to know if they were really that terrible. Ju Hyung agreed they were. Seojin said Han never asked for anything, not understanding if the options were that strange. Ju Hyung sighed because he really had no idea and wondered if she could say something, without hurting his feelings in any way. Although it wasn't the answer Seojin was expecting, he had looked for options all day, and she replied that his sister had other interests, like makeup, and suggested he could buy a lip tint at a department store. He replied that he'd never bought any of those things before and wanted to know if they sold them online. Ju Hyung said it was always better to try one before buying, and he asked if he should just buy what they recommended, only making the situation worse. It was obvious he was completely clueless, so she suggested they could go together to buy it after school, and she would get her own gift for Han along the way. He asked if she was free, and she replied that she was. She would just go home for a quick shower and then meet him later, so they arranged to go out. With Ju Hyung thinking she never imagined a brother like him could really exist in real life, though she had an older sister who was practically an older brother. She almost felt envious of Han and wondered what she could buy for her. Maybe just a blush. That's when Kang noticed she was planning to go out with Seojin from her messages. She was curious about that situation even more since Lee used to be a bright and outgoing person, but suddenly he had become who he was now. It might be related to Seojin somehow, her intuition was telling her so, and she thought something might be going on between them, asking if Ju Hyung was going out with Lee, something she denied, even though Kang said he didn't seem so bad the last time she heard, suggesting she ask him why they didn't get along. After all, the protagonist would meet Seojin later, and she denied it because surely they must have their own reasons, just changing the subject to look at the photos she took from the show. Later, Ju Hyung went out to meet Seojin, and she was impressed because he had a presence that could certainly stand out like no one else would normally. It made her think she should have dressed up a little more and not gone out so casually as she did, but he just considered if they should take the bus to get where they wanted to go. At the store, the protagonist feels even more pressured by the many gazes directed at them, as everyone was interested in Seojin, who was indeed very handsome. When they reach the products, he's unsure of what to choose, and Ju Hyung says she researched online and found that a new brand was especially recommended, Despite suggesting they try it out, he replies that she should test it herself and try it for him, which didn't seem ideal to her, given the style. Her skin was too yellow, and Han had a completely different tone, so what was best for her might not suit Ju-hyung. This makes Seojin sigh about the hassle. Deciding to ask for a recommendation, the protagonist then has the idea to test the products on him, even as Seojin tenses up in the chair. She assures him he can trust her. It's necessary this way, since he has the same skin tone as her sister, making things clearer this way. She tests a lip tint, while the staff is busy. Ju-hyung asks if she can try it on him, and despite his nervousness, Seojin tells her to go ahead. With this reaction, the protagonist tells him he could close his eyes if he feels embarrassed. First, she cleans his lips with a remover and uses her fingers because she's out of brushes. Ju-hyung notices his lips are about 2 centimeters thick. They're beautiful, so he should audition as a lip model. They were truly worthy of an artist. He responds that's definitely not going to happen, making her complain that talking would smudge the product. Seojin glances at Ju-hyung's face, blushes, and looks away. Mentally frustrated because she was too close, Ju-hyung finally finishes and shows him how good it looks on his skin. It has enough moisture for daily makeup. Then, she decides to pick out a blush as well, and he heads off to pay for them first. Once done, she asks if he's hungry, and they both catch a familiar smell. They run off to grab something delicious to fill their stomachs, just what Seojin needed after all the effort. She's curious, realizing he also liked sweet things, which was a relief because her brother Young never understood why she liked them. He replies that it's ridiculous not to like them when they're so delicious. Still, it surprises Ju-hyung because he didn't seem like someone who'd really eat sweets, and Seojin says he wouldn't go that far. To the protagonist, he didn't seem like someone who'd eat anything too sweet or greasy, yet he was a guy with excellent taste in food. Finally, the two decide to leave when the mall closes. They get on the bus, and Ju-hyung notices he must be delayed because of the crowd. However, she shivers as she starts to imagine things. She feels a creepy vibe behind her. It must just be the crowded bus, and she didn't want to exaggerate, but it was clear there was a strange guy behind her. Seojin quickly notices Ju-hyung's discomfort and steps in between them, and she thanks him for it. He tells her just to look forward. When they arrive, Ju-hyung sighs in relief for finally getting there, and he says it's good to know, saying goodbye to her. She waves, saying she'll bring a big cake for Han later. That's when he stops her to hand her something. Since she took the time to go shopping with him, he wanted to return the favor. It's what she was trying in the store earlier. She could consider it a gift to make up for the things he did that day, and the protagonist is surprised, thanking him for the kind gesture. At home, she tries the product and is surprised because she loves the result, never imagining Seojin would buy something like that just because she helped him pick out a birthday gift. It wasn't that hard, and she'd thought before that he might be a bad guy, but he was completely different. It was true that rumors never told the truth about people. Meanwhile, after getting home, Seojin was still embarrassed after what he went through with Ju-hyung at the stores, not understanding why he couldn't stop thinking about her. Suddenly, he gets notifications on his phone. It's Lee messaging him, asking if he could see him for a moment, so the two meet outside the house. Seojin asks what he wanted, and Lee asks how long they should stay so tense with each other, which makes him sigh at his boldness for visiting him there. After calling him out just for something like that, as Lee falls silent, he turns to go back inside. A bit later, Han asks him about the gift bag in the living room. It made her happy to receive something from her brother. Besides, she mentioned that she ended up seeing Lee near her gym, and it seemed he still had that same demeanor as before. But Seojin didn't care and told her to leave, making her sigh because he was really temperamental. However, Seojin's mind was still troubled by recent events. He had a nightmare of his old friend begging for help, asking him to answer the phone because he couldn't breathe and needed help. Then he woke up from the nightmare, gasping. After that, he took some medication to calm himself, and the next day, Ju-hyung went to school as usual, thinking the worst part of arguing with her mother was this, especially because she couldn't have breakfast, and her final exams started that week. That's when she saw Lee in front of her and approached to greet him in the morning. She commented that she was surprised since she thought he always arrived late at school. Lee just stared at her, making her nervous as she was eating a cereal bar for breakfast. She asked if he wanted some too, offering one of the new bars for him to eat. Lee just observed her before pointing to her lips where some crumbs remained. Blushing, she realized she needed to clean up, not noticing that a motorcycle was speeding nearby, and Lee moved closer to pull her arm and prevent her from being hit. Ju-gi-young felt nervous about being so close to him, and she stepped back slightly, though Lee was still holding her hand, only letting go when she mentioned it. She was startled to realize that her cereal bar had ended up staining his shirt, and she apologized, offering to wash it for him. Even as Lee said it was fine, she insisted, nonetheless. She said she'd just need to scrub it with soap, and it would be like new, asking him to hand it over for a moment, and Lee handed her the shirt anyway, making her promise to clean it quickly. Ju-gi-young gave him the other cereal bar in case he was hungry, making him thank her, and she headed to the girls' restroom, feeling embarrassed. Not just for staining his shirt, but for being so close to Lee. Even though it shouldn't be a big deal, she still wondered why she saw him that way. It was strangely romantic, maybe because he was too handsome, but it was ridiculous, because a relationship like that could never happen. So Ju-gi-young finished cleaning the shirt. While taking care of it, she accidentally bumped the shirt into Sejun's face, and she laughed nervously because she didn't even see anyone nearby in the hallway. He asked why she was waving that shirt in front of his face, and Ju-gi-young apologized again, asking if she hurt him, but he brushed it off finally. Then he asked why she was throwing her boyfriend's shirt in his face like that, making her embarrassed, since they weren't dating or anything like that, and he continued teasing, wanting to know if it was at least a crush. And Ju-gi-young stammered that it was an absurd topic since Lee was just a friend, but he noticed her embarrassed tone. She replied it was nothing like that, she had just been caught off guard, and it wasn't a big deal. Sejun decided to drop it because it didn't really matter. The two joked with each other for a while until the end of classes, when Ju-gi-young found something at home, not understanding what that envelope of money left there was. He said it was for her university enrollment, which shocked the protagonist, asking where her sister got that money, and she replied that it wasn't like that. She was only lending it, not giving it for free. She could pay her back later. Still, the protagonist hugged her sister, whining even though she reeked of alcohol. With that, he asked her sister to go buy some hangover medicine, and Ju-gi-young agreed, just hoping she wouldn't suddenly bump into Sejun on her way. Ju-gi-young sent a message asking where Sejun was, and he replied that he was at karaoke, catching her off guard because it was a faster reply than she expected. This made her sigh in relief, saying it wasn't a big deal and she didn't have to worry about accidentally running into someone inconvenient, so she decided to buy an ice cream too. To her complete shock, Sejun's two idiot friends were also inside when they were supposedly all at karaoke, making Ju-gi-young shrink back and try to hide. However, it seemed they were just his friends and not Sejun, but it was still a problem because she should just hurry home before being seen. Nonetheless, someone called out to her. She freezes in place before turning to see two girls who ask if she has a minute to talk to them. Ju-gi-young recognizes them immediately without a second thought. They were the two girls who used to bully her and treat her like a servant. She greets them, noticing that one of them looks the same, while the other is quite different. They laugh, saying it's nice to see her. It really is a small world, and it's been a long time. They ask what school she went to, and she stammers, saying she went to one close to her house. Thinking it's not good to see them, especially since they weren't even friends, Ju-gi-young feels uncomfortable as they continue laughing at her. They mention that she really hasn't changed and ask if she still reads those comics, noticing she's wearing a little makeup on her face. They laugh even more, saying her face looks a bit better, remembering how shocked they were back then when it looked like she painted her lips blood red. It was hilarious to see. Ju-gi-young can't move her body. It's been 3 years, yet she still feels speechless in front of them, unable to respond or retaliate. They say she looks like a decent person now, suggesting she try makeup and maybe get her eyelids done someday, adding that she couldn't survive on her own forever. One of them mentions she's debuting in a girl group, and Ju-gi-young congratulates her, surprised, as the girls talk about it. They ask if she holds a grudge against them for what happened in middle school, saying they were friends and were just joking around, hoping she doesn't resent them for it. Surely she wouldn't, so they cover normal conversation among friends. Ju-gi-young agrees, though she thinks it's absurd that they call it all just a joke. One of the girls wants to add her on social media to be friends, saying she'll be busy after her debut, but they could keep in touch if possible. Obviously, the protagonist doesn't want any of that. She never wants to stay in contact or see either of them again. She just wants to go home and forget about these girls altogether. While the two keep pushing for an answer, Seojun's two friends suddenly interrupt, telling them to shut up and control themselves because they're talking too loudly in public. The girls are a bit shocked, and Joo Hyung takes the chance to stand up, saying she needs to leave because her sister is waiting for her. She ignores them as they call after her. It felt like a nightmare, and she hopes never to see them again. She sighs, grateful that Seojun's friends were there to help her, even if unintentionally. The girls sit back at the table, muttering insults about Joo Hyung, saying she might post hateful comments about them later, but they doubt she would. Still, one of them gets nervous, saying she seems like the type to stay in her room all day, writing things on the internet. The other says it's not like they were intimidating her. She was a loser anyway, and the first one agrees, still shocked to see her wearing makeup. It seemed like girls like her never really changed. It was embarrassing to look at the protagonist and her failed attempts to be someone in life. Meanwhile, Seojun's friends sigh, realizing that there are always girls like them around. Finally, some peace and quiet come when Joo Hyung leaves, but they soon notice she left her wallet behind. If only they'd looked around more carefully. That's when Seojun shows up to greet his friends, and they mention the singing session he finished after some time. Seojun notices one of them holding a different wallet and asks about it. His friend explains it's not his. Some girl dropped it, and he intends to return it later. Seojun laughs, saying it would be impossible to find a specific person that way. But another friend mentions that if there's an ID inside, they could put it in a mailbox and have it returned by the postal service. So Seojun takes the wallet to check the ID, surprised to realize it's Joo Hyung's because they go to the same school, wondering when she had been there. One of his friends tells him to take care of it. They change the subject, asking about another friend's girlfriend they've been waiting for. She finally shows up, and they complain that she was late. Meanwhile, Joo Hyung throws herself onto her bed, exhausted, wondering if she really needed to get all made up when she just wanted to step outside for a quick walk around the block. It was so annoying. Of all places, they had to show up at that cafe. After everything they had done to her, they still wanted to call her a friend like that. She wondered about the debut they were discussing before, not understanding how bad people could always do well in life, still having the nerve to talk. Trying to silence the protagonist through their own actions, worried about hateful comments. It was absurd. Suddenly, he entered the room, asking her sister to return her credit card. The protagonist put her hand in her pocket and froze upon realizing her wallet was missing. She jumped up, telling her sister she'd be going out again because she forgot something outside. She put on makeup, and he asked if she was crazy, not understanding why she'd put on so much makeup just to go to a snack bar. But Joo Hyung didn't answer and just left. It had been hours since she left the snack bar, so she didn't know if she could even get her wallet back. After running back in a panic, she realized it was indeed gone. She panicked, thinking the two girls must have taken her wallet, or maybe someone else had. Her ID was still in it, and her life was only getting more chaotic. Suddenly, Seojun noticed she was there and approached, commenting that she looked funny, handing her the wallet she'd been looking for. Joo Hyung was visibly relieved and thanked him, not understanding how he got it. But the important thing was that it was found, even if by coincidence. However, Seojun's friends mentioned she wasn't the same girl who dropped the wallet, and she froze in place. One of the boys' girlfriends approached, complimenting her. She asked if she was Seojun's girlfriend, and Joo Hyung thanked her for the compliment, with even his friends noticing that her makeup and clothes matched perfectly. The single friend asked if she'd eaten because she could join them if she wanted, but his girlfriend whispered for him not to do that, saying they'd go out at another time. Reading the room, they left Seojun alone with the protagonist in the snack bar. He was confused, wondering why Joo Hyung suddenly looked so sad. He asked if she'd eaten, and she replied she'd just eat at work, probably in about 3 hours, which seemed way too long to wait for Seojun. In reality, the protagonist wasn't really hungry, but he suggested they have tteokbokki anyway, and she immediately felt like eating, making him comment with disgust that she was drooling, and she laughed, apologizing, mentioning she knew a great place near the station where they could eat together, so they left the snack bar. Joo Hyung noticed Seojun was very tall, and he mentioned not knowing his own height because he hadn't checked in years. He was probably around 6'1" in the end. But Joo Hyung was also tall, though she denied it because she felt short next to him. She remembered needing to call her sister and asked him to go in first while she'd follow. Meanwhile, Lee was at the psychologist, saying he didn't feel he deserved to be happy, and the doctor mentioned the medications should work better than last time. Because he was having trouble sleeping, the doctor was going to prescribe another pill. Lee asked what he should do now, and the doctor replied that he could try the new medication. It would work, and they ended the session for now. He could pick up the prescription when leaving. Meanwhile, the protagonist was realizing that Seojin clearly couldn't eat anything, especially spicy, given the amount of water he was drinking constantly, and she wondered what exactly he was thinking when he suggested they eat together. Seeing him sweating, Ju-hyung asked if he was okay, and even while burning up, he agreed that he was fine, though she could tell he didn't look fine at all. So, she changed the subject, mentioning that he would be graduating soon and asking what he planned to do afterward. He replied that he'd probably just make money somehow. Ju-hyung asked if he didn't plan to go to college, and he didn't see any reason for it, saying he just wanted to start working right away, and she said she understood his point. Getting a job right away seemed like a good idea too, and he asked about her. Ju-hyung said she wanted to study cosmetology soon. She didn't care which university she got into, but she was definitely going to study, which seemed interesting to Seojin since she'd turned his sister into a whole new person. So she could make anything possible, and she replied that it was only because Han was naturally beautiful with or without makeup, then began reflecting. She asked how he'd met his two friends before since they weren't from his school. Seojin explained that when he left the company, the old agency where he worked, the stylist, there was starting a new brand or something similar, so he went there a few times to help with some people's photo shoots. While the director was helping him get adjusted for the photos and he was being photographed, Seojin met his two friends, who mentioned they were opening a mall nearby soon. They asked if he was interested in working as a model for them. That's how Seojin began working with those two, and it's been a long 2 years since then. Ju-hyung responds that it's really cool and notes that he's been busy for a long time. Meanwhile, those same two friends seem agitated, feeling as if people were talking behind their backs. They comment on how Seojin doesn't use social media. He would bring in a lot of customers to their mall, even though he asked them not to use his face too publicly. They hadn't received many orders for a while, and that's when Ju-hyung suggested Seojin could become a singer in the future. He had the right look and sang really well. It would be a shame if he didn't take advantage of it. But Seojin immediately denies it, so directly that it almost scares Ju-hyung. He explains that after seeing someone die without reason in this business, nothing could change his mind about it, which shocks the protagonist, who is desperate to change the subject. So, Ju-hyung suggests maybe she could try participating in a musical like Han. When he just stares at her, she gets nervous and apologizes, saying she only thought he sang really well. Anyway, she suggests they should leave now that they're done eating. Later, Ju-hyung goes home, reflecting on Seojin being a famous model. She's a bit curious to see his photos, but doesn't know which mall he's working for. Then she notices that one of the suggested connections on social media is none other than Seojin's friend, Ji-hoon Wang. Realizing this must be the photographer he mentioned earlier, she searches through his profile and quickly finds photos of Seojin. It doesn't take long for Ju-hyung to find them, and she's impressed because, despite him being handsome, they seem to be wasting his talent. Suddenly, he appears to call her sister, reminding her that Ju-hyung herself said the final exams would start the next day. He asks if she's even studied at all, noticing she's just focused on her phone. The protagonist replies that she'll do it soon, and her sister responds that if she doesn't get into college, she'd better pay back every cent of her money quickly. The next day, Han asks how Ju-hyung did on the exam, and she replies that it probably went okay, just a little better than last time. She thinks it's great, hoping that if she keeps going like this, her efforts might pay off. However, on the last day of exams, she's caught off guard by what she sees. She can't believe it, even though Lee helped her with notes, and now she's embarrassed to face him after getting such terrible and low grades. Suddenly, Seojin appears, surprising Ju-hyung, who asks what he's doing at school and if he's there just because of the student exams. He responds that he's never missed an exam, while she failed them all. That's when Ju-hyung notices Lee nearby, and she stammers, saying she needs to leave immediately. She almost runs away from him, worried that Lee will talk to her about those low scores. As Lee and Seojin pass each other, they ignore one another, until Lee finally messages Ju-hyung, asking if she's in the classroom. She gets nervous, unsure of how to respond and embarrassed to say anything. It doesn't take long for Lee to come to her classroom to talk, and Ju Hyung sweats nervously, stammering that he must have gotten top marks, though it's hard to achieve. She thought she had memorized everything, but instead, Lee hands her a flyer for a movie adaptation of a book and asks if she'd go see it with him. Ju Hyung agrees, still stammering about the finals and wondering if he didn't come to ask her about that, and he asks if she's not going home yet. The two walk outside to head home, and Ju Hyung observes him, thinking he's perfect. She quickly looks away when he glances her way, noticing her gaze. She tries to play it off, saying she probably has neck pain from the exam. Soon they reach a train station, and the protagonist notices an elderly lady with a heavy bag. Wondering if she should help her, she watches as the lady drops her bag, sending apples rolling everywhere. The lady moves closer to the street to retrieve them. Before she can hear what Lee is saying, Ju Hyung rushes forward to help the lady, and he yells for her to be careful as a bus speeds up and almost hits them. But before Ju Hyung could get hit, Lee stepped in front and saved her, leaving everyone around in shock as he was the one who got hit instead. They quickly called an ambulance, and at the emergency medical center, they noted that his head was bleeding when he arrived, and he was now unconscious. They began by checking his vitals, asking Lee to open his eyes and hold on, needing to start the CT scan immediately. Ju Hyung shrank, crying and in shock, unable to believe what had just happened. A nurse nearby approached, asking if she knew how to contact his family, and she nodded, still trembling. Then she realized her phone wasn't turning on. It was damaged during the accident, but she tried to stay focused despite her worry for Lee, so she called Han, asking for help. She wanted Seojun's number, and her friend noticed how terrible Ju Hyung's voice sounded and asked what had happened, but Ju Hyung replied that it wasn't a good time to talk. She'd explain later but needed Seojun's number, and Han gave it to her. Ju Hyung mentally pleaded for him to pick up now because it was too important. When Seojun answered, he was confused by the sudden call, and she stammered, explaining that Lee had been in an accident and she needed to know if he had his family's contact info. Seojun shouted in shock, asking where she was now. Ju Hyung replied that she was at the university hospital emergency room, and then she waited, trembling, for people to arrive. After a short while, Seojun came running, saying he called Lee's sister on the way, and the protagonist thanked him. He sighed, explaining that it seemed Lee's family was out of the country, and he wondered what Lee was thinking. Ju Hyung told him Lee was hit by a bus. She was trying to save an elderly woman from being struck, and he had stepped in, pushing her aside. Seojun asked how he was doing, but the protagonist couldn't say because there hadn't been any updates yet. Soon after, a staff member asked if there was any news from Lee's family, and Seojun explained that his family was overseas and couldn't do anything right now. Wanting to know his condition, she asked him to follow her, leaving Ju Hyung in her chair, crying in fear, until Seojun returned, asking why she was acting like he died when Lee was fine. Ju Hyung asked what they told him, and Seojun said it was a brain hemorrhage, but surgery wasn't necessary. They would monitor him. He also had fractures in his neck and ribs. Ju Hyung blamed herself, saying it was all her fault, and he replied that it wasn't true and she shouldn't feel that way. Besides, Lee would be okay. That's when he noticed the protagonist's knees were injured, saying they should also take care of her wounds. She was still bleeding after falling to the ground. Seojun left and returned with some band-aids, asking if Ju Hyung was sure she didn't want to see a doctor first. The protagonist observed him taking care of her, mentioning that her knees would probably scar. That's when he rushed in, wanting to know what happened. Ju Hyung started crying and ran to hug her sister. Seojun was surprised and approached, saying she should be taken home since she was likely still a bit in shock. He agreed and would do that now, asking him to look after Lee for the time being. Then she guided the protagonist out of the hospital, who was still crying desperately. After a long time in the hospital, Lee woke up, and the doctors asked if he was feeling okay. The next day, Lee was still accompanied by Seojun, who had stayed the night with him, and was surprised to see him awake, feeling nervous. Then Seojun mentioned that he never expected to have to babysit an adult man, never even visiting the hospital when Han was sick with a bad flu. Lee asked how he found out about the accident, and he explained that Ju Hyung had called him. Lee wanted to know how she was, and he replied that she was fine. Lee felt relieved. Then Seojun said he'd spoken to his sister on the way. He shouldn't worry because he hadn't talked to his father and had asked his sister to do the same. Moreover, he was glad Lee had woken up. Seojun would never have forgiven him if he hadn't. He should consider himself very lucky. Lee then began talking about his past with him, saying he hadn't missed Sion's call that night on purpose. Then we flash back to the story of Sion, who was beaten up by some guys. They were beating up Sion because they thought he was the one who ratted them out before. Even though he insisted he wasn't responsible, the guys didn't believe him and kept laughing. They called him an idiot, saying he looked pretty and delicate like a girl, and suggested they should pull down his pants to see if he was really a guy underneath those clothes. Sion begged them not to, which only made them want to hit him even more. Suddenly, a book hit one of the guys on the head. He turned, demanding to know who did it, and there was Lee, stammering as he told them to stop. The guys continued hitting Sion, laughing at Lee's awkward interruption. They mocked him, asking what he'd do if they didn't stop, and kept hitting the boy lying on the ground. The bully leader said they'd stop hitting them if Sion just admitted it was them who reported them and no one else. But as he stayed silent, refusing to say anything, it looked like they'd beat him up even worse. That's when one of them got punched hard in the face. He turned to see who it was, and this time, Seojun had shown up. One of the bullies went after him, asking if he didn't have better things to do than meddle in other people's lives. But Seojun didn't hesitate before hitting the guy. Both Sion and Lee, who had been getting beaten up, just watched in shock as Seojun took down each of the bullies, finally calling them pieces of trash. Sion asked if he was in his class, but instead of answering, Seojun turned to leave. Sion then asked Lee if he knew the boy who just saved them. He replied that they were classmates but weren't close. He was also someone who didn't talk much or hang out with others. He kept his distance from everyone. The next day, Seojun was in his corner listening to music when Sion approached to thank him for helping out the day before, but Seojun just looked at him and stood up to leave. Still, throughout the day, Sion kept watching Seojun from a distance, leaving him confused. The truth was that he wanted to find a way to get to know him better. After classes, Lee and Sion decided to leave together when they heard a sound coming from a room. They realized it was Seojun, listening to music alone in a corner. They were especially surprised because he could sing very well. But when Seojun noticed their presence, he blushed with embarrassment and asked how long they'd been there. Covering his face in embarrassment, Sion stepped closer and complimented his voice, asking if he'd mind training as an idol with him since they could practice together. Even though Seojun refused, Sion persisted, wanting to know if he was practicing on his own and suggesting they audition together, even chasing him down the halls. He kept suggesting they could sing together, to the point where Seojun had to tell him he was really annoying. But Sion thought the world needed to know his talent. With a sigh, Seojun responded that if he did it, Sion would have to leave him alone and never bother him again, making Sion happy because that meant they'd be partners now. Excited for their first official practice day, the two of them met to sing. Sion explained things, though he couldn't reach high notes yet, but Seojun encouraged him to keep trying. As time passed, Lee joined them too, and the three spent more time together as friends. The truth was that Seojun and his family were going through tough times, and they were there for him before he even realized it. Time passed until the day of the audition, where Sion told Seojun to do his best and not slack off for anything. Just being nervous wasn't an excuse, and Seojun replied he would, finding it embarrassing to hear those words from him. Sion handed him a gift, a lucky charm. Seojun laughed, saying no fool believed in such things, but Sion insisted it was better to be safe than sorry in times like these. A few days later, Sion asked Seojun if he also received the message, and that's when they discovered he'd passed the audition. The two celebrated their success. Seojun thought they'd become singers as soon as they passed the test, but time went on, and things got tougher. The instructor demanded that he practice even harder, telling them to push themselves more, as they couldn't debut that way. There was still a long road ahead before Seojun could become a true singer. Time passed, and Sion saw that he practiced even later. Still, Seojun was the best singer in the group. He shouldn't at least take his position in dancing as well. He didn't really mind, and Sion accompanied him during night training, teaching him the correct way. But the efforts became quite manageable over time because they were working hard together, even at Seojun's father's funeral, who had taken his own life due to debt. Lee and Sion were there for him and his family to help. He could get through things with them by his side. They were all he had. When he worked at the agency with she told him he could debut soon. He couldn't let that shake him. They could try out for future auditions to keep improving. Although Sayeon was going to participate in an audition, Seojin would have to sit this one out because he'd injured himself while practicing, saying he didn't want to make a fool of himself. Sayeon could go alone, even though he begged to go with his amazing and talented friends. Still, Seojin told him to go. They would all be cheering for him. But now he regretted encouraging him to go on that show, even after he passed the audition. Both friends praised him for his efforts because they knew he could do it. Sayeon said he still had a long way to go, and they said he'd have to go to training camp the following week. They wished him luck, even though they would have loved to go with him if it hadn't been for Seojin's injured arm at the time and other obstacles. They decided to go out that night to the movies to have some fun. Along the way, many girls admired the beauty of those three guys who looked like idols. They even wanted to ask for their numbers, but they arrived early at the theater, and Sayeon suggested they take some photos in the booth, super excited. But Seojin refused, finding it embarrassing since they were all guys, yet in the end, they went and took many funny photos, laughing at their faces and expressions. They laughed because sometimes B would make his eyes too big, and Seojin would look tense. That's how they took the photo that later ended up in Seojin's house, which Ju-kyung eventually found. Little did Seojin know that would be the only photo they'd take together. He would have taken even more if he'd known what was coming. Time passed, and one day Seojin visited his friend Lee after practice class and offered him something to wear because he smelled. On the news, there was a report about idols, and they sat down to watch it, hearing about the competitors. Only 6 lucky ones would be chosen out of the 50 contestants, and they saw Sayeon among the people on TV. Lee said his friend should have gone too, but he replied he was terrible at dancing and would have been eliminated right away. The audition show Sayeon joined became a huge hit. He became incredibly popular. People were constantly talking about him and his dance skills, praising his efforts, videos, and performances. And just when everything was going so well with his debut, suddenly, his sister showed him her phone, revealing some comments about Sayeon. They said he'd been good at first, but now he was desperate for attention. It was embarrassing to watch, saying he wasn't the center, and it was disappointing how much he wanted it, wishing for Sayeon's downfall and saying other terrible things about him. It seemed they edited him to look bad to get more views, and it was complicated because Sayeon was a sensitive person. His sister urged Seojin to call him. Seojin tried calling his friend, but there was no answer, leaving him confused. He messaged, asking if he was okay, wondering if he could sue these people. They were going crazy over him, and the producer was a big jerk for distorting his image. That's when Sayeon replied, apologizing for missing his call and laughing in the message, asking him to vote for him among the finalists. Though Seojin thought he seemed fine, he was still worried and asked Sayeon to call him if he needed anything. Meanwhile, Sayeon was reading messages from people saying he should be eliminated, shouldn't debut, wasn't attractive enough, didn't have an interesting story, and so on. A few days later, the top 6 were announced, and everyone appeared on the TV screen. Finally, the last one to be voted in was Sayeon, with over 800,000 votes. They said he'd been loved from the first day he performed on stage. All his friends celebrated for him as he cried on TV, thanking everyone who believed in him. He wanted to prove himself to those who doubted him before, so Sayeon debuted in the idol group, starting to dance and perform, though show business could look so glamorous on the outside. But Sayeon was going through hard times. People still talked about his sad story with his grandparents, saying he just wanted to be seen as a pitiful person and gain attention. There were many cruel comments about him not being masculine enough, echoing the same hateful remarks that the bullies used to say about him in the past. Gradually, Sayeon began to wonder why they hated him so much, if they truly wanted him gone so badly. Eventually, he started to panic. On stage, all he could remember were the mocking messages. He even had to step out to breathe because he felt anxious, and his group members noticed something was off with him. They knew it was the hateful comments coming his way. The next day, people were questioning why Sayeon was absent from dance practice, some laughing because he didn't show up. Even though he was supposed to be a professional, he refused to appear, and some hoped he'd give up. One day, he decided to leave early, but overheard his colleagues discussing the situation. The company told them to stay quiet about it, saying not to be affected by nasty comments. They just needed to ignore it and not read them. They thought he could overcome it because he was young. When he met with Seojin, he noticed that his friend seemed tired. Seojin couldn't keep up with all the articles about him, but he asked if people were still bothering him over it. Seon replied no and changed the subject to Seojin's arm injury. Even though that day, Seon wanted to talk about how hard it had been for him, he couldn't bring himself to do it, not in front of his friend. A friend who was still a trainee, Seon didn't want to complain. But if Seojin had known it would be the last time he'd see him, he wouldn't have let him go in such a lonely and sad way. I noticed that many people who watch our content aren't subscribed to the channel. I need your support to keep making those videos, so if you could help by subscribing, I'd be really grateful. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. See you next time. Bye-bye.